There is a war that most people never talk about. Not the one fought under floodlights and thundering artillery, not the one captured in newsreels and celebrated with ticker tape parades. This is the war that happened in the dark, beneath the surface of an ocean so vast it swallows secrets whole. A war where men sealed themselves inside metal tubes, sank into crushing black water, and simply waited. You have seen the aircraft carriers, you have heard the names of the great admirals, you have watched the battleships. But underneath all of it, underneath the smoke and the ceremony and the strategic maps, there was another dimension of the Pacific War, one fought in silence, one fought slowly, one fought by men who understood that the most dangerous weapon on Earth is not the one you can see, it is the one that was already there before you knew to look. This is not a story about heroes and villains. This is a story about a nation that arrived at war with one of the most sophisticated and diverse undersea fleets the world had ever assembled, and then, through a series of decisions that still puzzle historians and naval scholars to this day, failed to use it in the way it was designed to be used. It is a story about engineering that was breathtaking, doctrine that was flawed, ambitions that were extraordinary, and outcomes that were, in many ways, heartbreaking. Stay with us, because over the next several hours, you are going to go beneath the surface. You are going to meet the men who built these machines, the men who sailed them, and the commanders who deployed them. You are going to understand, perhaps for the first time, the full arc of Japanese submarine warfare from its quiet, uncertain beginnings in the early 1900s, all the way to the extraordinary, almost unbelievable story of the largest submarines ever constructed before the nuclear age, submarines that were designed to launch aircraft, submarines with a range that could circle the globe, submarines that were ready to change the war and never got the chance. Before we begin, if you are watching this late at night and you want something to drift off to something rich, detailed, and told without rushing, you have found the right place. We are going to go deep, we are going to go slow, and we are going to stay down here for a while. So get comfortable. Let the world above the surface fall away, because the silent war is about to begin. If this kind of long-form history is something you return to, consider subscribing. Every chapter in this series has been built for the long watch. We will see you down here. Chapter 1. The Borrowed Weapon, Japan's first submarines and the birth of an undersea fleet. There is something quietly ironic about the beginning of this story. The nation that would go on to build the largest submarines the world had ever seen did not invent the submarine. It did not even design its first ones. Japan bought them in pieces, shipped across the Pacific in crates from the very country it would one day go to war with. That is where this story starts. Not in the fire and urgency of 1941, not in the roar of Pearl Harbor. It starts at the turn of a century, in the drafting rooms of New England and the naval yards of Yokosuka, with a question that every rising power eventually has to ask itself. How do we fight a navy larger than our own? In the year 1904, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a decision that would shape everything that followed. The Navy had been watching the development of submarine technology with growing interest, and when the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War created urgent pressure for new naval capabilities, the decision was made to purchase 5 Holland-type submarines from the Electric Boat Company of the United States. These vessels were partially dismantled, packed into shipping containers, and sent across the ocean to Japan in kit form, where they were reassembled by American engineer Arthur Bush at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. The submarines were commissioned as Type 1 through Type 5. They were small, imperfect, and petroleum-powered, but they were Japan's. And for the first time, the Imperial Navy had the means to strike from below the water. The timing was almost theatrical in its cruelty. The 5 submarines were ready for combat by 1905, but the Russo-Japanese War had already reached its decisive turning point before they could be deployed. The Great Naval Battle of Tsushima, in May of that year, had already been won above the waterline. Japan's surface fleet had annihilated the Russian Baltic Squadron in one of the most lopsided naval victories of the modern era. The submarines, built with such urgency, arrived too late to matter. They were relegated to training roles, and yet, That experience planted something important in the minds of the Imperial Navy's planners, the understanding that the submarine was not a curiosity or a gimmick. It was a weapon for the future. A weapon that, properly used, could alter the balance of power at sea in ways that no surface fleet alone could achieve. Over the next 2 decades, Japan did not stand still. The Kawasaki shipyard in Kobe purchased plans directly from the Holland Company and began building additional submarines under the guidance of American technical supervisors, gradually developing the domestic engineering knowledge that would eventually make Japan self-sufficient in undersea construction. The Navy studied the submarine campaigns of the First World War with intense attention, watching how German U-boats had brought the British Empire to the edge of crisis by targeting merchant shipping and drawing lessons both tactical and technical from the carnage in the Atlantic. By the 1920s and into the 30s, Japanese submarine design had moved beyond imitation. Engineers were experimenting with larger hull types, longer ranges, and integrated aircraft carrying capabilities that no other navy had yet seriously considered. The ambition was expanding, quietly and steadily, beneath the surface of public attention. The doctrine that developed alongside these engineering programs was, however, shaped by a set of assumptions that would prove deeply consequential. Japanese naval thinking in the interwar period was dominated by the concept of the decisive battle, a single climactic engagement between the main Japanese and American battle fleets somewhere in the Western Pacific, in which Japan would annihilate American naval power and force a negotiated peace. Submarines, in this framework, were not independent weapons, they were supporting actors. Under formal Japanese naval doctrine, submarines were considered auxiliaries to the fleet scouts and advance raiders whose primary purpose was to locate, shadow, and wear down the American battle line before the surface fleets engaged. This was the doctrine embedded in the General Battle Instructions of 1934, which stated plainly that submarines were deployed for the purpose of surprise attack on the enemy's main force. Commerce raiding the strategy that had made German U-boats so devastatingly effective was barely mentioned. This doctrinal choice was not made in ignorance. Japanese naval officers knew what the Germans had achieved against British shipping. They understood the mathematics of supply chain attrition. But the culture of the Imperial Navy was built around surface warfare, around the heroism of the gun engagement and the torpedo attack at close range. The submarine was not glamorous. It did not fit cleanly into the mythology of naval courage that the Imperial Navy had cultivated since the days of Admiral Togo and the Battle of Tsushima. Submarine officers existed in a kind of professional twilight, respected for their technical skill, but never quite at the center of the Navy's institutional identity. This cultural reality would constrain submarine operations throughout the war in ways that no amount of engineering excellence could overcome. What Japan did develop, in compensation for the doctrinal limitations, was an extraordinary diversity of submarine types. By the eve of the Second World War, the Imperial Japanese Navy operated the most varied undersea fleet of any nation. Manned torpedoes, known as kaiten, midget submarines of the Ko-Hyoteki and Kairyu classes, medium-range attack submarines, purpose-built supply submarines, long-range fleet submarines capable of carrying aircraft, and experimental high-speed designs that pushed the boundaries of what submerged propulsion could achieve. The technical specifications of these vessels were, in many cases, extraordinary. The Type 95 torpedo, the standard weapon of the large I-class submarines, was oxygen-propelled, leaving no telltale bubble trail, and carried a warhead of comparable power to those of the best Allied torpedoes. The range of the fleet submarines was genuinely staggering, capable of operations across the breadth of the Pacific without resupply. The contrast between Japan's technical achievements in submarine design and its strategic employment of those same submarines is one of the central tensions of the Pacific War. Japan's submarines would, across the full course of the conflict, sink roughly 1 million tons of Allied merchant shipping, a number that sounds significant until you compare it to the more than 14 million tons sunk by German U-boats, or the nearly 5 million tons sunk by American submarines operating against Japanese merchant vessels. The disparity is not explained by inferior equipment. Japanese submarines were, in many cases, as capable as anything their adversaries operated. The disparity is explained by doctrine, by command culture, by institutional priorities that valued the fleet engagement over the supply line, the warship over the transport, the dramatic strike over the slow, grinding attrition that wins long wars. But all of that is still in the future. In the 1920s and 1930s, Japan is building, experimenting, and imagining. The engineers at Yokosuka and Kure and Kawasaki are drawing blueprints that will eventually produce machines of astonishing ambition. The admirals in Tokyo are writing doctrine and arguing about strategy and preparing for a war they believe they can win quickly, decisively, and on their own terms. The submarine fleet is growing year by year, becoming more capable, more diverse, and more powerful. And somewhere in those years of preparation, a question is forming, a question that will not be fully answered until the last months of the war, in circumstances nobody could have predicted. The question is this: what is a submarine for? The answer Japan gave to that question, the answer embedded in doctrine and culture and command, would prove to be the wrong one. But to understand how the wrong answer was reached and what the consequences were, we need to follow the story forward. We need to go to the place where the quiet years of preparation ended and the war began in earnest. We need to go to the harbour of Pearl Harbor, before the sun came up, before the aircraft appeared in the sky, when the first weapon of the Pacific War was already in the water, and it was a submarine. Chapter 2. Before the planes, the midget submarines at Pearl Harbor. Most people know the story of Pearl Harbor through the aircraft. The waves of Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers and Zero fighters that rose from the carriers at dawn on the 7th of December, 1941. The story of that morning is written in the sky in the roar of engines and the arcs of falling ordnance and the rising columns of black smoke that could be seen from miles away. What most people do not know, what remained a largely obscured element of the attack for decades, is that Japan's first weapon at Pearl Harbor was not an aircraft, it was a submarine. And it was already in position before a single aircraft engine had been started. The midget submarine program had been one of the Imperial Navy's most closely guarded development projects of the late 1930s. The Type A Kohayoteki class midget submarines, roughly 78 feet long, powered by electric batteries, and crewed by 2 men, were designed for one specific purpose: to penetrate harbors too shallow and too congested for conventional submarines, and strike anchored capital ships with their 2 torpedoes. Each torpedo carried a warhead with double the explosive power of those mounted on the carrier-based aircraft that would follow them into battle. The midgets could achieve speeds of up to 19 knots, submerged extraordinary performance for the era, and they were intended to be Japan's secret weapon, the unseen strike that would catch the American fleet before it could even begin to react. The operation at Pearl Harbor called for 5 of these midget submarines to participate. They were transported to the waters off Oahu aboard 5 of the large I-class fleet submarines, each carrying 1 midget submarine in a specially fitted cradle on its deck. On the evening of the 6th of December, 1941, the night before the world changed, the 5 midgets were launched near the entrance to Pearl Harbor. Their crews understood, without flinching, that the probability of survival was minimal. The plan called for them to enter the harbor, discharge their torpedoes against the moored American battleships and carriers, attempt to exit the harbor after the air attack began, and rendezvous with the parent submarines offshore. The rendezvous, as it turned out, was a courtesy that fate had little intention of honoring. The first sign that the operation was not going according to plan came at 21 minutes before 4 in the morning, more than 4 hours before the air attack. The American destroyer USS Ward, patrolling the outer approaches to Pearl Harbor, detected a submarine attempting to follow a supply vessel through the entrance net. Ward engaged, and the contact was sunk. This was the first American offensive action of the Pacific War, not an aircraft, not a battleship, but a destroyer reacting to a submarine intrusion. The report was filed, sent up the chain of command, and in one of those organizational failures that haunt every major military surprise, not acted upon with the urgency it deserved. The significance of what Ward's crew had just done would not be properly understood until hours later, when everything else had already happened. Of the 5 midget submarines dispatched to Pearl Harbor, none succeeded in their primary mission. The details of each individual fate took years, and in some cases decades, to piece together. One, the submarine now known as Han-19, experienced navigational failures and was unable to penetrate the harbor. It ran aground on the eastern coast of Oahu the following day and was captured by American forces. Its commander, a young officer named Kazuo Sakamaki, became the first Japanese prisoner of war taken by the United States in the Second World War. The other 4 submarines met their ends in the harbor waters or the deep offshore approaches claimed by American warships in the chaotic hours of the attack. One, discovered in deep water off the harbor entrance by a research vessel decades after the war, lies there still a formal American naval landmark, undisturbed. The failure of the midget submarine operation at Pearl Harbor is typically treated as a historical footnote, a minor subplot in a story dominated by the aircraft. But there are historians who argue that the midget submarine effort at Pearl Harbor reveals something important about both the ambitions and the limitations of the Imperial Navy's undersea forces. The ambition was real and genuine, the willingness to deploy small, fragile, vulnerable craft against the most heavily defended naval installation in the Pacific required both engineering courage and tactical boldness. The limitation was equally real, the absence of coordination, the lack of confirmed damage attribution, the loss of 5 crews for results that could not be verified or built upon. The ratio of sacrifice to achievement at Pearl Harbor set a pattern that would repeat itself in different forms throughout the Pacific War. There is one further element of the Pearl Harbor operation that deserves attention. In addition to the 5 midget submarines, Japan had positioned approximately 13 large fleet submarines in patrol arcs around the Hawaiian Islands. Their assignment was to intercept American ships attempting to flee Pearl Harbor after the attack. In this role, which was a conventional submarine task, broadly consistent with international practice, the fleet submarines achieved virtually nothing. The American reaction was chaotic and improvised, but it was also faster than the Japanese had anticipated, and the patrol lines were not positioned to catch the traffic that eventually emerged. The fleet submarines around Hawaii in December of 1941 represent, in miniature, the story of the entire Japanese submarine campaign, positioned for a mission, unable to execute it effectively, and ultimately irrelevant to an outcome that was being decided elsewhere. The attack on Pearl Harbor temporarily paralyzed the American Pacific Fleet's surface combat power. 2 battleships were destroyed, several others were damaged and out of action for months. The carriers, the ships that would ultimately decide the Pacific War, were at sea and unharmed. Within hours of the attack, President Franklin Roosevelt issued an order that would prove to be one of the most consequential strategic decisions of the war. American submarines were placed under a doctrine of unrestricted warfare against Japan, meaning any vessel, warship, or merchant in Japanese-controlled waters was now a legitimate target, to be sunk without warning and without obligation to survivors. No such order came from Tokyo. While American submarines were unshackled and pointed at Japan's merchant lifeline, Japanese submarines remained governed by a doctrine that kept them focused on warships, fleet engagements, and the strategy of the decisive battle. The divergence in approach that would ultimately determine the war's outcome was established in the first hours of the conflict. The days after Pearl Harbor saw Japanese submarines ranging across the eastern Pacific in what appeared to be an offensive of significant scope. Patrols were extended toward the American west coast. Several American merchantmen were sunk in the weeks following the attack, the opening shots of a campaign that some in the Imperial Navy hoped might mirror the Atlantic U-boat campaign in its effects. But the comparison was misleading. Germany's submarine campaign in the Atlantic had been built on a foundation of strategic intent, the explicit goal of severing Britain's supply lines and starving the island nation into submission. Japan's submarine operations along the American coast in December of 1941 and January of 1942 were tactical forays, not a sustained strategic campaign. There was no institutional infrastructure, no dedicated command, no supply network, and no long-term plan for sustaining such operations. The patrols were impressive on a map and largely inconsequential in their effects. What Pearl Harbor truly established for the submarine arm of the Imperial Navy was not a platform for future success, but a demonstration of the gap between potential and reality. Japan had extraordinary submarines, extraordinary torpedoes, and extraordinarily brave crews. What it lacked was a strategic framework that understood how to use those assets to win a long war. That framework would not be built before the war ended, and the consequences of that absence would accumulate, slowly and then with gathering speed, across the years that followed. But on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, as smoke rose over Battleship Row and the world changed forever, the submarines were already underwater, already fading back into the dark. The silent war was being overtaken by the loud one, and nobody yet understood quite what that meant. Chapter 3. The year of the Hunter Japanese submarine successes in 1942. If there was a moment in the Pacific War when Japanese submarines appeared to be fulfilling their potential, it was the year 1942. It would not last, and the reasons why it would not last are as important as the successes themselves. But for roughly 12 months, the submarines of the Imperial Japanese Navy achieved results that no other undersea force in history had equaled in certain categories. They sank aircraft carriers, they damaged battleships. They conducted operations at ranges that no American naval planner had considered plausible. For 1 year, the submarine was the most feared weapon in the Pacific, and it flew the flag of the rising Sunday. The summer of 1942 was the setting for the campaigns in and around the Solomon Islands, a sprawling, malarial archipelago in the South Pacific that became the focal point of one of the most bitterly contested naval campaigns of the war. It was in these waters that Japanese submarines demonstrated their most lethal effectiveness. The I-class fleet submarines operating in the Solomons campaign proved capable of long-range patrols, torpedo attacks against moving targets, and the kind of persistent operational presence that posed a constant threat to American naval forces. They were hunting in contested waters against targets that were alert and defended, and they were finding them. The results were remarkable by any standard. 2 American fleet carriers were sunk by Japanese submarines in 1942, losses that, coming in a year when American carrier capacity was already strained to its limits, represented genuine strategic damage. The USS Wasp, a fleet carrier of 23,000 tons, was struck by torpedoes from a Japanese submarine in the waters south of Guadalcanal and went down with significant casualties. The USS Yorktown, already damaged by Japanese aircraft at the Battle of Midway and under tow for repair, was finished off by a Japanese submarine. Additionally, 2 battleships were damaged. 1 fleet carrier was hit twice and temporarily taken out of action, and a cruiser was sunk. By the metrics of warship destruction, 1942 was the most successful year in Japanese submarine history. The I-class boats, operating at ranges the Americans had not fully accounted for, were demonstrating that the fleet submarine doctrine using submarines against warships could, in the right conditions, produce devastating results. But the conditions were already changing. The American Navy was learning, adapting, and investing in the countermeasures that would ultimately make the waters of the Pacific far more hostile to Japanese submarines. Destroyers equipped with improved sonar were being assigned to carrier task force screens in greater numbers. Anti-submarine patrol aircraft were beginning to extend their coverage. The tactical protocols for protecting large warships from submarine attack were being refined with each engagement. Japan's submarines were succeeding against American carriers in 1942, partly because the Americans were not yet fully prepared for the threat. As that preparation improved, the window of vulnerability would narrow rapidly. There was another dimension to Japanese submarine operations in 1942 that received less attention at the time, but carries enormous historical significance. Japanese submarines conducted reconnaissance and shelling operations against the continental United States. The Pacific coastline of North America, from California to Oregon to Washington state, received intermittent visits from Japanese submarines that surfaced at night, and fired shells toward shore installations, oil facilities, a lighthouse at Fort Stevens in Oregon, and military positions. These attacks caused minimal physical damage, but their psychological effect was real and immediate. The continental United States, which had not been directly engaged by an enemy in well over a century, was now within reach of Japanese naval power. The implications were alarming enough that serious defensive measures were implemented along the entire west coast. The story of Japanese submarine activity in the waters around Australia in 1942 follows a similar arc of genuine threat, followed by structural disappointment. A submarine offensive in Australian coastal waters during 1942 and 1943 achieved relatively little, despite the presence of capable boats and experienced crews. The fundamental problem was one of strategic mismatch. The targets that Japanese submarines were being directed to attack were warships and naval installations, while Australia's vulnerability lay in its merchant shipping and supply lines. The doctrine that kept Japanese submarines focused on fleet assets was preventing them from attacking the supply infrastructure that would have genuinely damaged the Allied war effort in the South Pacific. Once again, the wrong answer to the question of what a submarine is for was costing Japan the strategic return that its technical capabilities could have delivered. At sea, the men inside these submarines were living and operating in conditions of extraordinary hardship that no civilian account of the war adequately captures. The I-class boats were large by submarine standards, but the spaces available to their crews were still measured in feet, not yards. The air inside a submerged submarine became thick and hot and stale over hours of submergence, carbon dioxide levels rising as men breathed and worked in sealed compartments that the sea pressed against from all directions. The tropical waters of the Pacific were warm, which reduced the thermal gradients that could mask a submarine from sonar detection, a physical disadvantage that Japanese submariners shared with every Allied submariner operating in the same waters. The difference was that Allied submarines were, by 1942, already receiving improved tactical support, better intelligence, and steadily improving equipment. Japanese submarines were operating on doctrine and courage alone. Supply runs to isolated island garrisons began in 1942 in a way that would consume more and more of the Japanese submarine fleet's capacity as the war progressed. As American surface and air power began to dominate the sea lanes of the South Pacific, the traditional supply routes to Japanese-held islands became increasingly dangerous. Fleet submarines, with their large carrying capacity, were pressed into service as underwater cargo carriers, running food, ammunition, and medical supplies to garrisons that were slowly being starved into helplessness by Allied naval superiority. Every submarine committed to a supply run was a submarine not conducting offensive operations. Every ton of rice or ammunition delivered to Guadalcanal or Truk or Rabaul was a displacement of the boat's original military purpose. The supply mission was not glamorous, not dangerous in the same way as a torpedo attack, and not consistent with the fleet action doctrine that had shaped the submarine arm's identity, but it was necessary, and its necessity was a sign of how the strategic situation was already deteriorating. The Battle of Midway, in June of 1942, which the submarines of the Imperial Navy participated in as part of the Outer Cordon and Scouting Screen, illustrated another persistent weakness in Japanese submarine employment. The plan at Midway called for a large number of submarines to be positioned in patrol lines between Pearl Harbor and Midway Atoll, where they would report on the movements of the American fleet and intercept American carriers attempting to engage the Japanese strike force. The submarines arrived at their stations late after the American carriers had already passed through the area heading for the battle. The intelligence the submarines should have provided reached Japanese commanders only after the carrier battle had already been decided. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost in a single afternoon. The submarines, still patrolling their empty cordon lines, could do nothing. The decisive battle had happened, and the decisive battle had been lost, without the submarine arm contributing meaningfully to either outcome. By the end of 1942, the balance of the Pacific War was shifting. The American victory at Guadalcanal in the long grinding campaign of the second half of the year established American offensive capability in the South Pacific and began the process of rolling back Japanese island positions that would continue without significant interruption until the end of the war. Japanese submarines had contributed to the defense of Guadalcanal in the sinking of enemy warships, in the supply runs, in the harassing patrols, but they had not altered the outcome. The island fell. The strategic initiative was passing to the Americans, and the Japanese submarine fleet, still formidable in individual capability, was already being consumed by the reactive defensive tasks that fell to it as the larger war tilted away from Japan's favor. 1942 was the best year Japanese submarines would have in the war. It had not been good enough. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Water Japanese Submarine Operations in the Defensive Phase, 1943. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from defeat, but from the slow recognition that the strategy you have committed to is wrong. Not wrong in the sense of incompetent or careless, but wrong in the sense of misaligned with the actual shape of the war you are fighting. By the beginning of 1943, the leadership of the Imperial Japanese Navy was beginning to grapple, not yet openly, but unmistakably, with the reality that the Pacific War was not going the way the pre-war planners had envisioned. The decisive battle had been fought at Midway and lost. The campaign at Guadalcanal had been a protracted, attritional ordeal that Japan had not been prepared for, and somewhere in the machinery of the Navy's strategic thinking, the question of what the submarine force was actually accomplishing and what it should be doing instead was beginning to acquire a new and uncomfortable urgency. American submarine operations against Japanese merchant shipping were, by 1943, starting to produce significant results. The unrestricted warfare doctrine imposed from the first days of the conflict was allowing American submarines to attack any Japanese vessel without restriction, and the effects on Japanese supply lines were becoming measurable. Japan's industrial economy was almost entirely dependent on imported raw materials: oil from the Dutch East Indies, iron ore from Southeast Asia, rubber, bauxite, copper, all of it moving by sea. The American submarines hunting Japanese merchant vessels were not fighting for headlines. They were fighting for oil and steel. And they were winning, slowly, battle by battle, ship by ship, in waters where nobody was watching. The Japanese merchant fleet was being consumed at a rate that Japan's shipbuilding industry could not match. The arithmetic of the campaign was clear, even if its full implications would not become obvious for another year or two. Japanese submarines in 1943 were being pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. The fleet submarine doctrine still called for operations against American warships, and patrols were conducted with that mission priority. Supply runs to isolated garrisons were increasing in frequency as the Allied island-hopping campaign began to sever the logistics chains that kept remote positions viable. Reconnaissance missions were being assigned with growing regularity as American offensive movements made accurate intelligence more critical. And a new category of mission was beginning to emerge: the transport of special weapons, specialist personnel, and covert cargo to positions where conventional surface access had become impossible. The Japanese submarine, originally conceived as a fleet weapon, was becoming a utility vehicle. The transformation was not the result of a deliberate strategic choice. It was the result of necessity, improvisation, and the relentless pressure of a war that was no longer going according to plan. The physical demands on submarine crews during this period were severe and becoming more severe. American anti-submarine capabilities, the combination of improved sonar, airborne radar, and coordinated hunter-killer tactics, were improving steadily throughout 1943. The waters around the Solomon Islands, the approaches to the major American fleet anchorages, and the shipping lanes connecting American logistics bases were becoming increasingly hostile environments for Japanese submarines. Boats that had operated with relative freedom in 1942 now faced the constant threat of detection and attack. The average depth of the Pacific Ocean in the combat zones, often thousands of meters, meant that a submarine forced below its operating depth by an attack had no friendly bottom to rest on, no shallows to hide in. You were either inside your pressure hull, alive, or you were not. The loss rate among Japanese submarines in 1943 began to increase in ways that could not be absorbed without long-term consequence. Replacement construction was continuing. The Japanese shipbuilding industry was still capable of producing new submarines, but the trained crews required to operate them were not replaceable at the same rate. The knowledge embedded in an experienced submarine crew, the feel for currents and thermal layers, the instinct for when to dive and when to run, the practiced efficiency of a team that has learned to live and work in compressed, high-stress circumstances takes years to develop and seconds to lose. The institutional knowledge of the Japanese submarine arm was being depleted at the same time that the operational demands on it were increasing. This was not a sustainable situation. In September of 1943, a Japanese submarine conducted one of the most remarkable long-range intelligence and special operations missions of the Pacific War, an indication that the submarine force was still capable of extraordinary individual feats. Even as the strategic situation deteriorated, submarines were used to insert and extract special agents and intelligence personnel from locations across the Pacific and Indian Oceans to conduct photographic reconnaissance of Allied installations at ranges that surface vessels could not achieve, and to maintain communications with Japanese forces that had been cut off from conventional supply lines. These missions were frequently successful at the individual level. A small number of highly capable boats and their skilled crews demonstrated over and over again that the technical and human potential of the Japanese submarine force remained very high. The gap between individual capability and strategic outcome was one of the defining tragedies of the entire submarine campaign. The debate within the Imperial Navy's command structure over how to employ the submarine force is one of the less documented aspects of the Pacific War, but it was real and it was consequential. The General Battle Instructions of 1934 had established the formal doctrine, but doctrine is not the same as consensus, and by 1943, there were voices within the Navy arguing that the American submarine campaign against Japanese commerce demonstrated the potential that Japan's own submarines were failing to realize. The counter-argument that Japan's submarines were too few, too committed to fleet support, and too technically suited to warship attacks to be rapidly reoriented toward commerce warfare was not without merit. The logistics of changing doctrine mid-war, with boats already assigned to specific mission profiles and crews trained for specific tasks, were genuinely complicated. But the conversation was happening, and its existence suggests that the Japanese Navy was not simply blind to the strategic opportunity it was missing, it was constrained from seizing it. The American drive through the Central Pacific, which began in earnest with the assault on Tarawa in November of 1943, placed new pressures on Japanese submarine operations. The assault on Tarawa and the subsequent advances through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands put American forces within range of critical Japanese positions that had previously been considered secure. The Navy's submarine force was directed to assist in the defense of these positions both through offensive patrols against American naval forces and through the intensification of supply missions to garrisons that were increasingly besieged. The supply mission at Tarawa failed to prevent the island's fall. The offensive patrols against the American assault forces achieved limited results against a task force that had deployed substantial anti-submarine protection. Once again, the submarines were present, active, and largely unable to alter an outcome being decided by other forces. By the end of 1943, it was possible for an informed observer to identify the trajectory that Japanese submarine operations were on. The force was still large, still technically capable, and still crewed by committed and experienced men. But it was being consumed by defensive missions at the same time that its offensive potential was being suppressed by enemy countermeasures that were improving faster than Japanese countermeasures could keep pace with. The supply run had become the defining mission of the Japanese submarine, replacing the torpedo attack as the primary activity of the fleet. And the supply run, however necessary it might be, was a statement of strategic retreat. You supply a garrison that cannot be supplied any other way when you are losing the battle for the sea lanes. Japan was losing the battle for the sea lanes, and the submarines, sent deeper and deeper into that losing battle, were paying the price with steadily mounting losses and declining strategic return. Chapter 5: The Iron Coffins, the Human Cost and the Machinery of Sacrifice. There is a temptation, when writing about submarines, to let the machinery of it, the technical specifications, the operational records, the strategic analyses, crowd out the human reality. The displacement tonnage and diving depths and torpedo load specifications are clean and verifiable and safe to discuss. The men inside the machines are harder to discuss. Their experience does not reduce to numbers. But any honest account of the Japanese submarine war must spend time inside the pressure hull, in the dark, with the crew. Because the submarine was not merely a weapons system, it was a habitat, a world unto itself. And the world it created for its inhabitants was one of the most psychologically and physically demanding environments that warfare has ever imposed on human beings. The large I-class fleet submarines of the Imperial Japanese Navy were, by the standards of the era, substantial vessels. Some of the most advanced types displaced more than 2,000 tons and measured over 350 feet in length, but size is relative inside a pressure hull. The living spaces for crews of around 100 men were minimal bunks, stacked in narrow compartments, shared in rotation between men on different watch cycles, so that the mattress was almost never cold. Meals were prepared in a galley the size of a modest closet and consumed in a compartment where men could not quite stand upright. Fresh water was rationed strictly. Fresh air was available only when the boat surfaced, which in contested waters it did only at night and with extreme caution. The smell of a submarine on a long patrol, diesel fuel, cooking, human perspiration, battery acid, machine grease became so pervasive that men ceased to notice it after the first few days and were overwhelmed by it again only when they finally returned to open air. The physical demands of submarine service were compounded by the psychological demands of operating in an environment that was, by its nature, defined by concealment and uncertainty. A surface warship crew, however terrified, could see the threat approaching. They could observe the battle, judge distances, watch the horizon. Submarine crews could do none of these things. The world beyond the pressure hull was accessible only through instruments, the acoustic receptors of the sonar equipment, the periscope's narrow slice of vision, the depth gauge and the hull stress indicators that told you how far down you were and how much further down the sea wanted to take you. When a depth charge exploded nearby, when the hull rang like a struck bell, and the lights went out and the metal groaned with the pressure wave, the crew's entire understanding of their situation was mediated through instruments and through sound. They could not see what was trying to kill them. The Type A Kohyoteki midget submarines, the smallest of the Japanese Navy's undersea fleet, created conditions that were extreme even by the standards of submarine service. These two-man craft, the same type deployed at Pearl Harbor, placed their crew in a space barely large enough to stand in, with battery power for a limited operational endurance and no provision for emergency egress once submerged. The crews of these vessels were aware, when they were launched from their parent submarines toward their assigned targets, that the probability of completing the mission and surviving was low. The rendezvous procedures were nominal points on a chart where, if conditions permitted and the ocean was cooperative, a parent submarine might be waiting. In practice, conditions rarely permitted, and the ocean was never cooperative. The midget submarine crews were, in the most literal sense, accepting that their machines were their final assignment. This is not the same as being ordered to die, but it requires a quality of commitment that no civilian account of the war adequately honors. Japanese submarine casualties throughout the Pacific War were severe. Of the approximately 176 submarines that the Imperial Navy operated during the conflict, the majority were lost before the war's end. The mechanics of submarine loss at sea were, in almost every case, a matter of seconds, a depth charge pattern that found its target, an aerial bomb delivered before the boat could dive to safety, a surface engagement that the submarine could not disengage from quickly enough. In rare cases, a collision or mechanical failure. Whatever the cause, the end of a submarine was almost always the end of its crew. There were no lifeboats, No emergency egress procedures that functioned reliably under combat conditions. No rescue protocols that could realistically be implemented in a war zone. When a submarine was lost, everyone aboard was lost with it. The casualty rate in the Japanese submarine service was among the highest of any military specialization in the Second World War. The culture of sacrifice that pervaded the Imperial Japanese military establishment was both a strength and a complication when applied to the submarine service. The willingness to accept losses, to continue operations in the face of mounting casualties, and to place the mission above personal survival was genuine and consistent, but it also made it harder to learn from loss. In a military culture that valorized acceptance of death, the detailed analysis of why a submarine had been lost, the tactical failure, the procedural error, the doctrinal misjudgment that had placed the boat in an untenable situation was less culturally welcome than it was in a military culture that valued survival as a prerequisite for future effectiveness. American Submarine Command made the analysis of loss a central part of its operational learning process. Japanese Submarine Command did not do this with the same systematic rigor. The consequence was that lessons that might have saved subsequent boats and crews were learned incompletely or not at all. The relationship between the submarine crews and the command structure that directed their operations was, in many cases, one of profound disconnect. Submarine officers understood, from their operational experience, the difficulties of executing fleet engagement doctrine in the conditions they actually encountered. They understood that the American anti-submarine response was improving. They understood that the supply mission was consuming their operational capacity. They submitted reports and compiled their observations. But the command culture of the Imperial Navy, hierarchical, resistant to upward critique, structured around deference to senior officers, did not create an easy channel for tactical knowledge to flow from the boats to the strategic decision-makers. The admirals directing the submarine campaign were working with incomplete information about what the boats were actually experiencing, and the boats were operating under doctrine that the admirals were not revising quickly enough to keep pace with the realities of the war. There were moments of profound individual courage within the Japanese submarine service that deserve recognition on their own terms, separate from any strategic judgment about the campaign as a whole. Submarine commanders who navigated through defended harbor approaches under active attack to deliver critical supplies to isolated garrisons were demonstrating a form of seamanship and nerve that was extraordinary by any standard. Commanders who identified and engaged American carrier task forces, the most heavily defended naval formations in the world, with the weapons available to them, were doing something that required both skill and courage in equal measure. The human quality of the men who served in Japanese submarines was not inferior to the human quality of those who served in any other submarine force in the war. What failed them was the system above them, not the character within them. By 1943 and into 1944, a generation of experienced Japanese submariners, men who had trained for years, who understood their boats with an intimate and hard-won knowledge, who had survived the early war patrols and developed the professional instincts that cannot be taught in a classroom, was being lost at a rate the Navy could not replace. Replacement crews were being trained and assigned, but the compression of training programs under wartime pressure meant that new crews arrived at their boats with less preparation than the men they were replacing. The experiential capital of the submarine service was being consumed by the war faster than it could be replenished. It was an invisible attrition harder to see on a strategic map than a lost island or a sunk carrier, but ultimately as damaging to Japan's ability to continue the fight as any surface defeat. The weight of the water was not only the physical weight of the ocean pressing against the hull, it was the weight of a war that was being lost, carried by men in sealed metal tubes in the deep dark, conducting missions that were becoming increasingly dangerous and increasingly disconnected from any clear path to the outcome the men had been promised. The decisive battle had not come. The supply runs were not saving the garrisons. The torpedo attacks were not halting the American advance. And somewhere in the command structure of the Imperial Navy, the understanding was growing, not yet spoken aloud, not yet written into formal assessments, that the war was entering a phase where the submarine would be required not to win, but to endure, to continue, to find new purposes in a conflict whose original purposes were slipping beyond reach. Chapter 6: The Impossible Vision, Admiral Yamamoto and the Birth of the Submarine Aircraft Carrier. Every so often in the history of engineering, a problem is solved in a way that is so unexpected, so diagonal to conventional thinking, that the solution itself seems like a category error, a crossing of conceptual lines that had previously been assumed to be permanent. The airplane and the submarine had always been understood, by virtually every naval planner in the world, as creatures of opposite environments. One lived above the surface, in light and air and open space. The other lived below the surface, in darkness and pressure and concealment. They were not natural companions. They were not designed to coexist. And then, in January of 1942, in the cabin of a Japanese flagship anchored in a harbor in the Western Pacific, an admiral picked up a pencil and began to sketch a different kind of vessel entirely. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto needs very little introduction to anyone familiar with the Pacific War. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor, the commander who understood, better than anyone in the Imperial Navy, that Japan could not win a long war against the industrial power of the United States. His strategy throughout the war was built on the premise of rapid, decisive action striking hard and fast before American industrial production could translate into battlefield dominance. Pearl Harbor had been the opening move of that strategy. Midway, which ended in catastrophic defeat, had been the intended finishing blow. By the early months of 1942, with the war not developing as he had planned, Yamamoto was looking for alternatives. On the 13th of January, 1942, he submitted a formal proposal to the Imperial Navy for a new class of submarine, a vessel that would carry the war not just across the ocean, but to the American continent itself. The concept was, by any measure, extraordinary. Yamamoto envisioned a fleet of 18 large submarines of unprecedented size and range, each capable of carrying multiple aircraft in a watertight hangar built into the pressure hull. These aircraft would be launched from the submarine's deck via catapult, conduct their missions, and return to land at a prearranged location. The submarines themselves would remain submerged for the approach, surfacing only for the brief period required to launch the aircraft, and then diving again to await the outcome. The combination of the submarine's concealment with the aircraft's reach created a weapons system that no existing defense could easily address, because no existing defense had been designed to detect a submarine that was also an aircraft carrier, or to protect against aircraft that had been launched from below the surface of the ocean rather than from a ship or an airfield that could be located, targeted, and neutralized. The initial proposal was ambitious, even by Yamamoto's standards. 18 submarines of this type, carrying multiple aircraft each, would have constituted a significant offensive force capable of threatening targets across the breadth of the Pacific and potentially striking the American mainland. The Navy approved the concept and construction began in January of 1943 with the lead ship to be designated I-400. The new class received the formal designation Sentoku Special Submarine. It was, by every technical measure, going to earn that name. The engineering challenges were enormous. To mount an aircraft hangar on a submarine to integrate the structural requirements of a watertight, cylindrical hangar with the pressure hull requirements of a deep-diving vessel required solutions that had never been attempted before. The designers at the Naval Construction Bureau worked through these challenges with an ingenuity that commands respect regardless of the purpose for which the vessels were intended. In April of 1943, something happened that would change the trajectory of the Sentoku program in ways that none of the project's supporters could have anticipated. Admiral Yamamoto, the primary champion of the submarine aircraft carrier concept, the man whose vision had initiated the program and whose authority had sustained it against institutional skepticism, was killed. American signals intelligence had intercepted and decoded a Japanese naval communication detailing Yamamoto's scheduled inspection flight through the Solomon Islands. Fighter aircraft were dispatched to intercept the transport and its escort. The admiral was killed when his aircraft was shot down over Bougainville Island on the 18th of April, 1943. His death was a strategic shock to the Imperial Navy and a personal loss to the submarine program specifically. With Yamamoto gone, support for the ambitious 18-boat construction plan dwindled rapidly. The order was reduced eventually to a production run of just 5 vessels, of which only 3 would be completed. The 3 completed submarines of the Sentoku class I-400, I-401, and I-402 were, when they entered service in the closing months of 1944 and the first months of 1945, genuinely unlike any vessel the world had yet seen. The I-400 displaced more than 6,000 tons surfaced comparable to a light cruiser and measured over 400 feet in length. Its range was extraordinary, capable of traveling 1.5 times around the circumference of the Earth without refueling. It could reach any point on the globe's oceans from a Japanese port. The hangar built into its forward deck could accommodate 3 Aichi M6A Seiran aircraft, a float plane specifically designed for the program, with folding wings and tail surfaces that allowed it to be stored in the cylindrical hangar and assembled for flight in a matter of minutes after surfacing. The catapult system could launch a fully loaded aircraft into the air within a fraction of the time required by conventional carrier operations. The aircraft themselves, the Seiran, were remarkable machines in their own right. Designed from the outset for the specific mission of the submarine aircraft carrier program, they were not adaptations of existing types, but purpose-built weapons optimized for rapid deployment from a confined space. The folding wing design allowed 3 of them to be stored nose to tail in a hangar that a single conventional aircraft would struggle to fit into. The folding of the wings and tail surfaces, the attachment of the floatplane pontoons, the loading of the aircraft onto the catapult, the full sequence of preparing a Seiran for launch had been drilled and refined until the crew could accomplish it in a time frame that minimized the submarine's exposure on the surface. In tests and exercises, the time between surfacing and aircraft launch was reduced to a matter of a few minutes per aircraft. For a weapon system that had seemed almost fantastical when Yamamoto first sketched it, the engineering had delivered something genuinely functional. The targets that the Sentoku submarines were designed to attack evolved with the changing strategic situation. The original concept had centered on strikes against the American mainland, specifically against cities and industrial targets that lay beyond the reach of any other Japanese weapon system. As the war progressed and the strategic situation changed, the planning shifted to more militarily specific objectives. The Panama Canal became the primary target in several planning documents, a target whose destruction would have significantly disrupted Allied logistics by separating the Atlantic and Pacific fleets and forcing an enormous diversion of shipping around South America. The canal's lock gates were, in engineering terms, a relatively compact and damageable target for determined aircraft, and no conventional Japanese bomber could reach Panama. A submarine that could surface within strike range of the canal without being detected by existing patrol systems could potentially achieve what no surface or air attack could approach. The Sentoku program occupies a unique place in the history of the Second World War, not for what it accomplished, which was nothing in operational terms, but for what it represents. It represents the reach of imagination in extremity. It represents the willingness of engineers and commanders operating under conditions of resource scarcity and strategic deterioration to attempt solutions that had never been attempted before. The I-400 class submarines were the product of extraordinary creativity applied to an increasingly desperate situation, and the desperation does not diminish the achievement, even if the achievement was ultimately overtaken by events before it could be tested in combat. The vessels were ready, the aircraft were loaded, the missions were planned, and then the war ended before the order to launch was given. The story of what did not happen with the Sentoku submarines, the missions that were planned, assigned, and then cancelled by surrender, is one of the war's great counterfactuals. Whether the destruction of the Panama Canal would have materially extended the Pacific War, whether the planned operations would have succeeded against the defenses that existed by 1945, whether the submarines themselves could have navigated to their launch positions without being detected, these questions remain genuinely open. What is not open is the quality of the engineering and the courage of the men involved. The I-400 class submarines were the largest submarines ever built before the nuclear age. They were built in response to a vision of a man who knew the war could not be won by conventional means and was willing to consider the unconventional. And they went to sea too late, in a war that had already passed the point where any single weapon system could change its course. End of chapters 1 through 6. Chapters 7 through 18 continue the story through the Sentoku operations, the Kaiten human torpedo program, the American submarine campaign against Japan, the final desperate defense of the home islands, the surrender and the post-war fate of the captured Sentoku submarines, including their scuttling by the United States Navy in 1946 to prevent their technology from reaching Soviet hands. This is a long watch. We are only just below the surface. Stay with us. Chapter 7. The Living Torpedo. The Kaiten Program and the Weaponization of the Self. There is a point in every failing war when the calculus of sacrifice changes, when the conventional exchange rates of weapon systems and strategic objectives no longer balance in your favor. The logic of attrition begins to demand something different, something that conventional military thinking would classify, under ordinary circumstances, as unacceptable. Japan reached that point in the second half of 1944. The island-hopping campaign had pushed American forces to within strategic striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The merchant fleet was hemorrhaging tonnage under the sustained campaign of American submarines. The carrier fleet that had opened the war with such devastating effect at Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea had been broken at the Philippine Sea and shattered beyond recovery at Leyte Gulf. And the submarine arm of the Imperial Navy, which had once sunk fleet carriers and ranged the length of the Pacific, was now being consumed by supply missions and battered by anti-submarine forces that had mastered the art of finding and killing undersea boats. In this context, in the gathering darkness of a war that was being lost, two junior naval officers presented a proposal that would eventually become the Kaiten program. What they were proposing was a torpedo that carried a man inside it. The men who conceived the Kaiten, the name translates, roughly, as "turn the tide of heaven," were Lieutenant Junior Grade Hiroshi Kuroki and Lieutenant Junior Grade Sekio Nishina, both midget submarine specialists who had trained with the Ko-Hyoteki program and who understood from their operational experience that conventional submarine attacks against heavily screened American warships were producing diminishing returns at mounting cost. Their proposal, submitted in early 1943, argued that a modified version of the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, fitted with an enlarged warhead, a pilot compartment, and a guidance system controlled by a human operator, could be steered to targets with a precision that no purely mechanical torpedo guidance system of the era could match. The human element, in their logic, was not a sacrifice appended to the weapon. The human element was the weapon's essential improvement, the guidance system that made a hit against a maneuvering, screened target achievable rather than probable. The Navy was initially reluctant. The proposal was reviewed, assessed, and set aside. It was not until the strategic situation had deteriorated significantly into 1944 that the Kaiten program received formal approval and the resources needed to move from concept to deployment. The technical design of the Kaiten evolved through several variants across the program's relatively brief operational life. The Type 1 Kaiten, the version most widely produced and deployed, was built around the oxygen-powered Type 93 torpedo engine, stretched to approximately 14.5 meters in total length, and fitted with a pilot compartment positioned behind the guidance controls and periscope. The warhead was enormous, more than 1,400 kilograms of explosive, nearly 3 times the payload of a standard aerial torpedo. In theory, a single Kaiten detonation against a large warship could be catastrophic. The weapon was designed to be carried to the operational area on the deck of a large I-class fleet submarine, launched through a wet transfer tube that allowed the pilot to board the weapon from inside the mother submarine while both vessels were submerged, and then guided to its target by the pilot using a combination of compass heading, estimated time of travel, and the brief periscope observations that the design permitted. At the final approach, the pilot was supposed to arm the warhead and commit the weapon to its terminal run. there was no extraction mechanism. Once launched, the Khitan was a one-way journey. The men who volunteered for the Khitan program and the official record consistently describes the recruitment as voluntary, though the social and cultural pressures surrounding military service in Japan at that stage of the war make voluntary a complicated concept. Were young, predominantly junior officers and petty officers who had absorbed the institutional culture of the Imperial Navy and the broader national narrative that framed sacrifice in defense of the homeland as the highest form of service. The individual motivations of these men varied as widely as human motivations always do: duty, family honor, peer influence, genuine ideological commitment, the simple human desire to matter in a moment of national crisis. None of these motivations can be reduced to a single explanation, and the effort to do so diminishes both the complexity of the historical reality and the humanity of the men involved. What can be said without reduction is that they trained seriously, they prepared carefully, and they went to sea knowing exactly what the weapon they were piloting was designed to do and what would happen to them when it did it. Training for Khitan operations took place primarily at Otsujima Island and at the Hikari Naval Base in western Japan, where the confined waters and controlled environment allowed pilots to practice navigation, target approach, and the specific techniques of managing a submerged weapon through a periscope of limited visibility. The training was demanding in the technical sense, learning to navigate a fast-moving, submerged torpedo by dead reckoning and periscope observation, maintaining orientation in three-dimensional space without the positional cues available to surface navigators, and doing all of this in a compartment barely large enough to turn around in. The physical claustrophobia of Khitan pilot training was not, by all accounts, the hardest part. The hardest part was the waiting, the days and weeks and months between training and deployment, when the knowledge of what was coming had time to settle into the body and become familiar. The first operational use of the Khitan occurred in November of 1944, when a group of mother submarines carrying Khitan weapons approached the anchorage at Ulithi Atoll, a massive American fleet anchorage in the Caroline Islands that had become, by that point in the war, one of the most significant naval bases in the Pacific. The scale of Ulithi was extraordinary. At peak capacity, it held more than 700 Allied vessels, including fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and the vast logistics infrastructure of tankers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels that kept the American offensive moving forward. For the Khitan planners, it represented a target of extraordinary value, dense, static, and potentially vulnerable to the kind of surprise attack that a weapon arriving from below the surface might achieve. The attack was partially successful. One American fleet oiler was sunk. Several other contact reports were filed, though the outcomes could not be confirmed. The loss of the oiler, a genuinely important logistical asset, was counted as a victory by the Japanese command, and the Khitan program was expanded. Subsequent Khitan operations through the first half of 1945 produced results that the official records and the operational assessments tell in somewhat different terms. The Japanese command reported a series of confirmations: warships hit, carriers damaged, significant vessels sunk. The actual American records, cross-referenced after the war, show a pattern of operation that was braver and more desperate than it was effective. The fundamental problem that the designers had intended the human guidance system to solve, the problem of hitting a maneuvering target against a screen defense, proved resistant to the solution in practice. American anti-submarine escorts were, by 1945, extremely capable and extremely alert. The approach of a Khitan, which required the mother submarine to close within operational range of a defended anchorage or task force, exposed the mother submarine to exactly the kind of attack it was designed to avoid. Several mother submarines were lost during Khitan operations, taking their pilots and the weapons still mounted on their decks to the bottom before a single Khitan could be launched. The weapon that was meant to turn the tide was itself being caught in a current it could not reverse. The total number of men who entered Khitan service across the program's operational life was several hundred, of whom approximately 100 were launched in combat operations. The confirmed sinkings attributable to Khitan attacks remain a subject of some historical dispute. American records acknowledge the loss of the fleet oiler at Ulithi and the sinking of a destroyer escort in the closing months of the war, with several other vessels sustaining damage from possible Kaiten contact. Whether these results justified the program in human terms, in strategic terms, in any terms that can be applied to the deliberate construction of weapons designed to kill their operators, is not a question that military history can answer. It is a question that moral philosophy has to sit with. What military history can say is that the Kaiten program did not turn the tide of the Pacific War. It added to a count of lost men in a war that was already decided by forces the Kaiten could not reach the factories of Michigan and Ohio, the wheat fields of the American heartland, the shipyards and refineries that were producing, month by month, an industrial output that no weapon system in the Japanese arsenal could match. The legacy of the Kaiten in Japan's post-war memory is a complicated one. In the immediate post-war period, the men of the Kaiten program were largely erased from official commemoration by a military and political establishment attempting to come to terms with both defeat and the ethical dimensions of the war it had fought. Gradually, over the decades that followed, a different kind of recognition emerged, one that acknowledged the program without endorsing it, that honored the individuals without ignoring the context in which they had operated. The Kaiten Memorial Museum at Otsujima Island in Yamaguchi Prefecture holds artifacts, personal effects, and records of the men who trained there. Visitors come, many of them young, many of them descendants of the men commemorated, to stand in the spaces where pilots waited and to try to understand something about a time when the choices available to human beings were narrower and darker than anything peacetime existence normally requires. The Kaiten does not allow comfortable conclusions. It was not designed to. The Kaiten program represents, in concentrated form, the central paradox of the Japanese submarine campaign in the Second World War. The technical ingenuity was genuine, the human commitment was real and costly. The strategic impact was minimal. The weapon that was meant to embody Japan's refusal to accept defeat became, in its operational reality, a measure of how far defeat had already progressed, because nations that are winning wars do not design weapons that require their operators to die with them. The Kaiten was born of desperation, sustained by courage, and ended by the same surrender that ended every other Japanese military program in August of 1945. The tide it was named to turn never shifted. The war ended the way it was going to end, with or without the human torpedoes. But the men who piloted them did not know that when they went to sea. They knew only what they had been told, that what they were doing mattered, that the sacrifice was meaningful, and that the homeland they were defending was worth the price they were paying. In that belief, whatever one thinks of the weapon and the program, they deserve to be remembered. Chapter 8. The American Answer. How United States submarines dismantled Japan's empire. While the story of Japanese submarine warfare is the explicit subject of this documentary, but that story cannot be fully understood without examining the campaign being conducted simultaneously by the adversary, because the contrast between the two submarine campaigns is itself one of the most instructive military lessons of the Second World War. The Japanese submarine campaign and the American submarine campaign were fought in the same ocean in overlapping time periods, with vessels of broadly comparable technical capability. The outcomes could not have been more different. Understanding why requires looking carefully at doctrine, strategy, institutional learning, and the willingness to make hard analytical decisions about what a submarine is actually for. American submarine doctrine at the start of the Pacific War was, in some respects, as confused and as fleet battle-oriented as its Japanese counterpart. Pre-war American fleet exercises had envisioned submarines primarily as fleet scouts and warship attackers, and the restrictions of international law, particularly the London Naval Treaties, provisions on the conduct of submarine warfare against merchant vessels, had shaped American thinking in ways that emphasized warship targets over commerce targets. The difference was that American doctrine changed. The unrestricted warfare order issued in the hours after Pearl Harbor removed the legal and doctrinal constraints on merchant shipping attacks. An American submarine command over the 2 years that followed systematically restructured its operational priorities around the commerce warfare mission. This restructuring was neither immediate nor painless. There were internal debates, command changes, and painful reassessments of failed patrols before the right framework was established. But the restructuring happened. American doctrine adapted. Japanese doctrine did not. The target that American submarines were oriented against Japan's merchant fleet was, from a strategic standpoint, the most vulnerable and the most consequential element of Japan's war economy. The arithmetic of Japan's strategic situation in 1941 was stark and well understood by American planners. Japan had almost no domestic sources of petroleum, iron ore, rubber, bauxite, or many of the other raw materials its industrial and military machine required. Everything came by sea. The merchant fleet that carried these materials was, therefore, not merely a logistical asset, it was the circulatory system of the entire Japanese war effort. Attack it persistently, with sufficient force and enough accuracy to sink ships faster than they could be replaced, and Japan's industrial capacity would decline, its military reach would contract, and its ability to sustain the war would eventually collapse. American submarines were pointed at this target from the opening days of the conflict, and they never looked away. The early results were disappointing, and the reasons for the disappointment became one of the most consequential investigations in naval history. American torpedoes were defective. The Mark 14 torpedo, the standard weapon of the American submarine fleet, had been tested inadequately in peacetime due to the expense of live-fire exercises, and the defects that existed in its design were not discovered until submarines were losing attack opportunities in combat because their torpedoes were either running at incorrect depth settings, failing to explode on contact, or both simultaneously. The investigation into the torpedo problems took the better part of 2 years to resolve fully, involving a series of increasingly frustrated operational reports, institutional resistance from the Bureau of Ordnance, and eventually the decisive personal intervention of Admiral Chester Nimitz, who ordered the contact exploder mechanism removed and replaced with a simpler percussion design. The torpedo problem, once resolved, unleashed the full offensive potential of the American submarine force. But it had cost 2 years of partially effective operations, 2 years during which Japanese merchant shipping survived at a higher rate than it should have. Once the torpedo problems were resolved and the operational doctrine was properly aligned with the commerce warfare mission, the results of the American submarine campaign became devastating in their statistical impact. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant vessels at a rate that Japan's shipbuilding industry could not approach matching. The tanker fleet, the ships that carried oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan's refineries and naval fuel depots, was being systematically destroyed. By the middle of 1944, Japan's oil imports had fallen to a fraction of pre-war levels. Aircraft training programs were curtailed because there was not enough aviation fuel to train pilots at the rate required to replace losses. Surface warships were immobilized in port not because they were damaged, but because they lacked the fuel to sail. The entire logistical foundation of Japan's ability to sustain offensive operations in the Pacific was being dismantled, ship by ship, in waters that the world's newspapers were barely reporting on because the submarine campaign, unlike the island battles, produced no photographs of heroism, no compelling visual narratives, no moments of obvious drama. The American submarine fleet's institutional culture was, throughout the war, oriented toward learning and adaptation in a way that contrasted markedly with its Japanese counterpart. Patrol reports were analyzed systematically. Commanders whose records suggested excessive caution were relieved and replaced with more aggressive officers. Tactical innovations, the wolf pack tactic of coordinating multiple submarines against a single convoy, the use of radar-equipped submarines to conduct night surface attacks, the development of coordinated intelligence sharing between submarines and aircraft were adopted and disseminated across the fleet with a speed that the Japanese anti-submarine forces found increasingly difficult to counter. The American Submarine Command treated the war as an operational research problem, one with lives as the stakes, but one in which the best analytical approach would produce the best outcomes. This was not cynicism. It was a form of institutional respect for the men in the boats who deserved to be given every advantage that command decisions could provide. The human experience of American submarine service in the Pacific was, in many ways, as grueling as that of the Japanese submariners it was contending against. The stress of long patrols in enemy-controlled waters, the claustrophobia and physical hardship of life inside a pressure hull, the psychological burden of operating in an environment where detection meant death. These were universally shared elements of submarine service, regardless of which flag flew from the periscope shears. What American submariners had, in addition to the universal hardships, was a growing confidence based on results they could observe in their patrol logs that what they were doing was working. The ships they attacked were sinking, the supply lines they interdicted were failing. The strategic damage they were inflicting was measurable and cumulative. This knowledge sustained morale in the way that no amount of encouraging official communications could substitute for. They were winning their part of the war. They could see it in the statistics. That knowledge mattered enormously to the men who were living underground in the ocean for months at a time. By 1945, the damage to Japan's merchant fleet had reached the threshold where it was materially constraining Japan's ability to fight. Shipyards were running short of steel. Refineries were running short of crude oil. Army units in China and Southeast Asia were struggling for ammunition resupply because the ships that would carry it were being sunk faster than they could be built. The Japanese Navy was, in the bluntest terms, running out of the fuel it needed to operate a consequence so fundamental that it shaped every tactical and operational decision of the war's final phase, from the rationing of destroyer escorts to the reduced training regimens that produced the underqualified pilots who flew against American forces in the war's final battles. The American submarine campaign did not win the Pacific War by itself. The island campaigns, the carrier battles, the aerial bombardment campaign of 1945, all of these contributed to the outcome. But the submarine campaign was the circulatory wound that weakened Japan's military body for everything that followed. It was the war beneath the war. And it worked in the way that the Japanese campaign never did, because it was aimed at the right target, the supply chain that fed Japan's ability to continue, rather than the warships whose destruction, however spectacular, left the supply chain intact. The final statistical accounting of the two submarine campaigns stands as one of the starkest contrasts in modern military history. American submarines, representing roughly 2% of the United States Navy's personnel, sank approximately 30% of all Japanese naval vessels destroyed during the war, and somewhere between 55 and 60% of all Japanese merchant vessels lost. Japanese submarines, by the end of the conflict, had sunk a smaller total tonnage of Allied merchant shipping than American submarines had sunk of Japanese merchant shipping in a fraction of the time. The comparison is not made to diminish the Japanese effort. The individual courage of Japanese submarine crews was not less than that of their American counterparts. The comparison is made to illuminate a strategic truth. A weapon pointed at the wrong target, no matter how well crafted and bravely wielded, cannot change the outcome of a conflict driven by economic and industrial forces. The right question, what is a submarine for, had been answered correctly by one side. That answer was worth more than all the technical sophistication in the world. Chapter 9. The long-reach Japanese submarines in the Indian Ocean and the global dimension of the Pacific War. The Pacific War is remembered, largely, as a Pacific conflict, a struggle for islands and atolls and the trade routes between them, fought in an ocean that seemed, from an American or Japanese perspective, to encompass the whole of the relevant world. But the war was not confined to the Pacific. It extended into the Indian Ocean, touched the coasts of East Africa, ranged into the South Atlantic, and connected the naval campaigns of Japan and Germany in ways that created, however briefly and imperfectly, a genuinely global dimension to the submarine war. The story of Japanese submarines in the Indian Ocean is one of the least told chapters of the Second World War, less dramatic than the carrier battles, less strategically significant than the Commerce War in the Pacific, but illuminating in its own way of the ambitions and the limitations of Japanese naval strategy. The Indian Ocean represented, from Japan's strategic perspective, an opportunity that was never fully exploited. Following the rapid conquests of early 1942 Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, the Indian Ocean islands of the Maldives, and the Andaman and Nicobar Chains Japanese forces had achieved a position from which the disruption of British supply lines to India and the Middle East was theoretically achievable. The Indian Ocean was, for the first 2 years of the war, vastly underdefended by Allied anti-submarine forces, most of which were concentrated in the Atlantic against the German U-boat campaign or in the Pacific against the expanding Japanese naval threat. A concentrated, sustained submarine offensive in the Indian Ocean during 1942 and 1943 might have created genuine strategic difficulties for the British position in the Middle East and India. The Japanese Navy never mounted that offensive. The submarines that operated in Indian Ocean waters in those years were present in numbers too small and for periods too brief to achieve the kind of systematic pressure that commerce warfare required. The opportunity existed. It was not seized. The most significant and most unusual dimension of Japanese submarine activity in the Indian Ocean was the exchange program conducted between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the German Kriegsmarine, the collaborative arrangement, through which German and Japanese submarines conducted long-range voyages between Europe and Asia, transporting strategic materials, technical documents, specialist personnel, and advanced weapons components that neither nation could obtain through conventional supply routes. These exchange operations, conducted under conditions of extraordinary navigation difficulty and operational hazard, represented a kind of submarine diplomacy, a material expression of the Axis alliance operating at the extreme limit of what undersea vessels could physically accomplish. The German-Japanese submarine exchange began in the early years of the war and continued, with varying intensity, through much of the conflict. German U-boats carried industrial diamonds, mercury, blueprints of advanced weapon systems, and specialist engineers to ports in Japanese-controlled Southeast Asia, while Japanese submarines made the reverse journey to German-occupied European ports carrying rubber, tin, and other raw materials that Germany's war economy urgently needed but could not obtain from continental sources. The distances involved were staggering. From the ports of East Asia to the German Biscay bases. The journey required submarines to transit more than 10,000 miles of ocean, passing through waters increasingly dominated by Allied anti-submarine forces. Not all of the submarines that attempted these voyages completed them. Some were sunk en route. Others turned back due to mechanical failure or the threat of interception. But a significant number did complete the journey, delivering their cargo and returning a feat of seamanship and endurance that deserves recognition regardless of the strategic context in which it occurred. One of the most significant items transported through the German-Japanese submarine exchange was technical documentation and components related to advanced German weapons programs that Japan hoped to replicate. Specifications for the German Me-262 jet aircraft, components of the Walter turbine submarine propulsion system, documentation related to German radar and acoustic detection technology, and details of other advanced German military developments were among the materials that made the long ocean crossing on the decks of exchange submarines. Japan's ability to translate these materials into operational weapons systems was constrained by both time and industrial capacity. The war ended before most of the transferred technology could be incorporated into production programs, but the intent to use the Axis alliance as a conduit for technological cross-pollination was genuine and represented a sophisticated understanding of how coalition warfare could multiply the effective technological base of each participant. The Indian Ocean also saw the operational deployment of Japanese submarines in roles that reflected the Navy's evolving use of the submarine as a multi-purpose vessel. Liaison missions to Japanese-supported independence movements in India and Southeast Asia used submarines to transport weapons, communications equipment, and political agents to coastal contact points in British-controlled territory. The famous mission to transport the Indian National Army leader Subhas Chandra Bose from Germany to Japanese-controlled Southeast Asia, accomplished in a remarkable relay involving both a German U-boat and a Japanese submarine in the southern Indian Ocean in 1943, demonstrated that Japanese submarines were being used for political and intelligence purposes that went well beyond the original naval warfare conception of undersea vessels. Whether these operations had any significant impact on the broader trajectory of the war in Asia is a question that historians continue to debate. What they demonstrate is the flexibility of the submarine as an instrument of policy, its ability to move people and materials in secrecy across distances that made conventional transport impossible. The British and Commonwealth naval forces that eventually built up sufficient anti-submarine capability to threaten Japanese submarines in the Indian Ocean were initially slow to respond to the undersea threat in those waters. The demands of the Atlantic campaign consumed most of Britain's anti-submarine resources through 1942 and into 1943, and the Indian Ocean remained, by the standards of the other major submarine theatres, lightly patrolled and inadequately defended. Japanese submarines that did operate there in significant numbers during the earlier phases of the war achieved results against Allied merchant shipping that were among the more productive of the entire Japanese submarine campaign. The tankers and cargo vessels moving between the Persian Gulf, India, and the Red Sea represented exactly the kind of logistical target that commerce warfare was designed to attack, and in the Indian Ocean, for a limited period, Japanese submarines attacked them with some of the effectiveness that their designers had envisioned when the fleet submarine program was first conceived. The broader strategic failure in the Indian Ocean mirrored the failure in the Pacific. Japan deployed too few submarines for too brief a period, without the doctrinal commitment to sustained commerce warfare that would have been required to convert local tactical success into strategic leverage. The window during which the Indian Ocean was genuinely vulnerable to a sustained Japanese submarine offensive, roughly the 18 months from the fall of Singapore to the consolidation of Allied anti-submarine defences in the future nations, the region was allowed to close without being fully exploited. By the time Japan's naval command might have reconsidered its deployment priorities, the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where submarines were needed elsewhere for defensive missions that had become more urgent than the offensive opportunity the Indian Ocean had once offered. The Indian Ocean chapter of the Japanese submarine war ends, like the Pacific chapter, in the weight of missed opportunity. The geography was favourable, the targets were accessible. The Allied defences were, for a critical period, inadequate to the task of stopping a determined submarine campaign, and Japan did not mount a determined submarine campaign in those waters. It mounted a series of patrols, useful, sometimes effective, occasionally spectacular, but never the sustained, systematic offensive that the strategic situation was calling for. The reasons for this were the same reasons that governed the entire Japanese submarine campaign from beginning to end: a doctrine built around fleet action rather than commerce warfare, an institutional culture that kept the submarine subordinate to surface battle priorities, and a command structure that could not adapt quickly enough to the strategic realities that the war kept presenting. The Indian Ocean was one more proof of a lesson that the Pacific was already teaching. Japan's submarines could reach everywhere. What they could not do was change the war. Chapter 10. The tide turns to storm Japanese submarine losses and the collapse of the undersea fleet. 1944. The year 1944 was, for the Imperial Japanese Navy as a whole, the year the mathematics became undeniable. The surface fleet lost the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, an engagement so one-sided that American carrier pilots referred to it afterward as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Leyte Gulf in October saw the largest naval battle in history by the number of ships engaged, and it ended in the effective destruction of Japan's remaining surface combat power as a coherent fighting force. The land campaigns in the Marianas established American bomber bases within range of the Japanese home islands. And the submarine fleet, which had entered the war as one of the most capable in the world, entered 1944 at a rate of loss that made clear the arc of its own trajectory. By the end of the year, the Japanese submarine fleet had been reduced in effective operational capability to something that bore little resemblance to the force that had gone to war in December of 1941. The acceleration of Japanese submarine losses in 1944 was driven by the maturation of American anti-submarine capabilities along multiple simultaneous dimensions. Airborne radar fitted to long-range patrol aircraft operating from the island bases that American forces had captured and developed across the Central Pacific campaign dramatically expanded the area of ocean that could be searched for surfacing submarines. A Japanese submarine that surfaced at night to recharge its batteries, a necessity that the battery technology of the era could not avoid, now faced the threat of detection from aircraft equipped with radar systems sensitive enough to pick up a submarine's low silhouette against the surface of the ocean. The frequency of air attacks on surfacing submarines increased sharply through 1944, forcing Japanese submarines to reduce the duration of their surface periods, which reduced battery recharge capacity, which reduced their submerged endurance, which constrained their operational flexibility in ways that fed back into their tactical effectiveness in a deteriorating cycle. Hunter-killer groups dedicated anti-submarine task forces built around escort carriers and destroyer escorts specifically assigned to the submarine hunting mission began operating in the Pacific in greater numbers. Through 1944, these groups combined the aerial search capability of carrier-based aircraft with the surface pursuit and attack capability of fast, well-equipped destroyer escorts in a coordinated system that was extremely effective against the generation of Japanese submarines then in service. Unlike conventional convoy escorts, which were reactive waiting for a submarine to attack before responding, the hunter-killer groups were proactive, searching areas of ocean where intelligence suggested submarine activity and pursuing contacts with persistence and resources that individual convoy escorts could not match. The intelligence that directed these groups was increasingly derived from signals intercepts. As American cryptanalysts continued to achieve success against the Japanese naval cipher systems that governed submarine communications, a Japanese submarine ordered to a specific patrol area was sometimes being tracked before it arrived there. The loss of experienced submarine commanders and crews in 1944 created a human attrition that compounded the equipment losses. Japan had begun the war with a relatively small number of highly trained submarine officers, men who had spent years in the submarine service, developing the professional knowledge and tactical instincts that the role required. These men could not be rapidly replaced. Training programs could produce new officers with the basic technical qualifications for submarine service, but they could not compress years of at-sea experience into a shortened training curriculum. The replacement commanders who took over lost boats in 1944 were, on average, less experienced than the men they replaced, not through any fault of their own, but because the war was consuming experienced officers faster than the training pipeline could develop new ones. The tactical quality of the submarine force declined as its casualty rate increased, which meant that replacement submarines were, on average, less effectively employed than the veterans they were replacing, a downward spiral that reinforced itself with each passing month. The supply mission, which had already consumed a significant fraction of the submarine fleet's operational capacity in 1942 and 1943, expanded further in 1944 as American air and surface power progressively severed the conventional supply routes to Japanese island garrisons across the Pacific. Submarines became, for many isolated positions, the only means of resupply still technically available. But the very isolation that made submarine supply missions necessary also made them more dangerous. The American anti-submarine forces that had cut the conventional supply routes were the same forces that now patrolled the waters through which submarines had to travel to reach the garrisons. Every supply run was a penetration of defended waters at slow speed, with the tactical disadvantage inherent in a vessel that had to navigate close to land in shallow water. The loss rate on supply missions was significant, and the strategic return, keeping a garrison alive for a few more weeks before it was overwhelmed or simply bypassed by the American advance, rarely justified the cost of the submarines lost in delivering the supplies. There were individual engagements in 1944 that demonstrated the submarine force was still capable of effective offensive action, even as the overall trajectory was negative. Several American warships were sunk or damaged by Japanese submarine attack during the various island campaigns, and the major fleet engagements of the year. The cumulative total of American naval losses to Japanese submarine action did not decline as rapidly, as the size and condition of the Japanese submarine fleet would suggest a reflection of the fact that the boats still in service were being pushed harder and their commanders were accepting higher tactical risks to produce results in a deteriorating situation. The individual acts of effectiveness only underscored the larger failure the fleet as a whole was losing its capacity to operate, and no number of individual successes could arrest the institutional decline. The Kaidai and I-class submarines that bore the main burden of Japanese submarine operations in 1944 were aging vessels. In many cases, boats that had been commissioned in the late 1930s or early 1940s and had been operating continuously, with minimal opportunity for the kind of comprehensive maintenance that extended the working life of complex machinery. The maintenance situation deteriorated throughout 1944 as the demands of continuous operations outstripped the capacity of Japanese naval yards, which were themselves under increasing pressure from materials shortages, labor constraints, and the diversion of industrial resources to other military priorities. Submarines returned from patrols with accumulated mechanical deficiencies that could not be fully addressed before the boats were needed again at sea. Equipment that was operating below specification was sent back into contested waters because the alternative, keeping the boat in port until proper repairs could be made, was not an option in a fleet that was running out of hulls. The psychological environment within the submarine service in 1944 was, by all available accounts, one of sustained and mounting strain. The men who had entered the service in the years before the war, or in its early phases, had watched their peers and commanders disappear into the ocean at an increasing rate. The patrols were harder, the enemy anti-submarine response was more capable, and the mission's supply runs to dying garrisons. Defensive patrols against an advancing enemy whose momentum no individual engagement seemed capable of slowing offered less of the sense of purposeful offensive action that had characterized the earlier years of the campaign. The institutional support systems that might have addressed this psychological burden were minimal. The Japanese Navy had no formal program for the kind of combat stress support that Allied navies were beginning to develop in recognition of the long-term human costs of sustained combat. Men returned from patrols, rested briefly in conditions that were often basic, and went back to sea. This was what the war required. It was not necessarily what the men could sustain indefinitely. By the close of 1944, the effective operational strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine fleet had declined to the point where it could not seriously contest American naval power in any of the ocean areas that the American advance was moving through. The fleet remained numerically significant. There were still boats in commission, still crews ready to sail, still commanders willing to take the risks that the missions required, but the strategic context had shifted so fundamentally that the submarine force was no longer a factor in the war's outcome. It was a residual force capable of inflicting local damage and occasional spectacle, but incapable of influencing the strategic trajectory that was carrying the war toward its conclusion. The year 1944 had taken the Japanese submarine fleet from capability to irrelevance, and the final year of the war would see it reduced further still to the desperate, extraordinary, and ultimately futile missions that the crisis of the home islands would demand. Chapter 11. The Final Missions. Japanese Submarines in the Defense of the Home Islands, 1945. When the Pacific War entered its final year, Japan was no longer fighting for expansion or strategic position or the maintenance of a defensive perimeter. It was fighting for survival. The home islands, the four main islands of Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku, and Hokkaido, and the chain of smaller islands that surrounded them, had become the central focus of Japanese military planning, as American air power ranged freely over the Japanese mainland, and the planning staffs on both sides of the Pacific worked through the implications of an eventual land invasion. In this context, every weapon system in the Japanese military inventory was being evaluated and repurposed for the single strategic purpose of making the defense of the home islands sufficiently costly that the Americans would negotiate rather than invade. The submarine force was no exception. Its final year of operations was shaped entirely by this defensive imperative, and it produced in that final year some of the most unusual and consequential submarine missions of the entire war. The threat of an American amphibious assault on the Japanese home islands, an operation that American planners had designated under the codename Downfall, with subordinate operations planned in 2 phases across the southern islands, and the Kanto Plain drove Japanese defensive preparations to extraordinary lengths. Every form of undersea weapon that Japan had developed or could develop was marshaled for the anticipated defense of the landing beaches. The Kite and Human torpedo program was massively expanded, with production accelerating and new pilot training programs established to provide the numbers of operators that the expanded program required. The Ko-Hyoteki midget submarines were supplemented by new types, the Kairyu 2-man midget submarine and the Koryu 5-man midget submarine, both designed for one-way attacks on landing craft and transport. Vessels in the inshore approaches to the home islands. Conventional fleet submarines were assigned defensive patrol positions in the waters, most likely to be used by American amphibious forces approaching the landing beaches. The Koryu submarine deserves particular attention as an illustration of how Japanese submarine design had evolved or perhaps devolved under the pressure of total defensive war. Where the I-class fleet submarines of the pre-war years had represented the ambition of a navy expanding its reach across the Pacific, the Koryu was the product of contraction, a small, relatively simple vessel designed to operate in confined coastal waters, crewed by 5 men and armed with 2 torpedoes or a bow-mounted warhead for ramming attacks. Hundreds of Koryu submarines were under construction or completed by the time the war ended, numbers that the pre-war program had never contemplated for any single submarine type. The resources being poured into these coastal defense vessels, steel, engines, skilled labor, were resources diverted from every other element of Japan's war economy. The priority assigned to undersea coastal defense in 1945 reflects both the seriousness with which Japanese planners regarded the invasion threat and the extent to which the strategic situation had reduced Japan's military options to the defense of its own shores. The conventional fleet submarines still operational in 1945 were assigned, in addition to their defensive patrol roles, to a series of missions that reflected the extraordinary circumstances of the war's final phase. The transport of critical materials, particularly oil and food, from remaining Japanese-controlled territories to the home islands, was assigned to submarines, because the surface convoy routes had become effectively suicidal under sustained American air and submarine attack. Submarine tankers and supply boats made the runs from Southeast Asian ports to Japanese home waters in operations that combined commercial logistics with the most extreme operational secrecy, submerging during daylight hours and using the limited cover of night for surface transit in waters that American submarines and aircraft patrolled with increasing density. These supply missions, whatever their strategic value, placed submarine crews in operational conditions that combined the hazards of wartime patrol with the particular stress of carrying cargo that was, in itself, a sign of how desperate the home island's supply situation had become. One of the most consequential and least discussed Japanese submarine operations of the war's final year was the role of submarines in the intelligence gathering and preparatory missions related to the anticipated American invasion. Japanese submarines, conducting reconnaissance of potential landing beaches in Kyushu, the island that American planners had selected for the initial phase of the invasion, were collecting information about American naval dispositions, amphibious training exercises, and the movement of invasion shipping that would allow Japanese commanders to anticipate the timing and location of the expected assault. This intelligence effort was genuinely productive. Japanese estimates of the likely invasion timing and landing sites for the planned American operation against Kyushu were remarkably accurate, as post-war declassification of both American planning documents and Japanese intelligence assessments has confirmed. The submarine reconnaissance effort contributed to a defensive preparation that, had the invasion occurred, would have confronted American landing forces with a scale of resistance that American planners were only beginning to calculate. The last major conventional submarine offensive of the Pacific War was directed against the logistics chain supplying American forces at Okinawa, the island that American and Japanese forces had contested in a campaign of extraordinary ferocity throughout the spring of 1945. Japanese submarines attempted to interdict American supply shipping to Okinawa in operations that ran from April through June of that year, with results that were limited by the density of American anti-submarine forces protecting the Okinawa logistics routes. Several American vessels were damaged or sunk in these operations, but the American logistical support for the Okinawa campaign was not seriously disrupted. The Japanese submarine effort at Okinawa was the last time the submarine fleet mounted a significant conventional offensive operation of the war. After Okinawa, the submarines were increasingly consumed by the coastal defense preparations and the supply missions that the final months of the war demanded. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945, and Nagasaki on the 9th of August changed the character of every Japanese military planning discussion in a way that nothing in the previous 4 years of war had. The destruction of 2 cities by single weapons was not merely a military shock, it was a conceptual disruption of the framework within which Japanese military planners had been operating. The planned defense of the home islands against invasion had been premised on the assumption that the Americans would need to put soldiers ashore, that the cost of the landing and the subsequent campaign would be calculable and potentially prohibitive, and that Japan's desperate defensive preparations could impose a price high enough to produce a negotiated settlement. The atomic bomb removed the premise from that calculation. The Americans did not need to land. The distance at which they could inflict destruction had moved beyond anything that a coastal defense, however dense and however manned by willing and determined defenders, could address. The surrender announcement of the 15th of August, 1945, the Emperor's recorded message broadcast to a nation that had never heard his voice, reached Japanese submarine crews at sea in waters across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The reaction among the crews was described by survivors in later accounts as a silence more profound than the silence of the ocean itself. Men who had left Japanese ports weeks or months earlier, who had been submerged in the dark while the world above the surface was ending the war that had defined their adult lives, surfaced into a reality that none of their training or experience had prepared them for. The war was over, the missions were cancelled. The orders that followed to surface, to display black flags indicating surrender, to proceed to designated Allied ports or await instructions created situations of extraordinary psychological complexity for men whose entire professional identity had been built around the continuation of a conflict that had just ceased. The Sentoku submarines, the I-400 class vessels that had been prepared for their final missions against American targets in the Pacific, received the surrender order while assembled for operations that were cancelled at the last possible moment. The aircraft in their hangars were destroyed before the submarines surfaced. The weapons were rendered inoperable. And then the largest submarines in the world sailed, surfaced, and defeated to meet the American naval forces that would take them into custody. The meeting between the American officers who boarded the I-400 and its crew, the Japanese submariners who had built and maintained and prepared these extraordinary machines, and the American naval engineers who recognized immediately that what they were looking at was unlike anything their own navy had produced was, by all accounts, a meeting marked by the professional respect that soldiers and sailors sometimes find for adversaries they have never met. The war was over. What the machines could have done was over. What remained was the machinery itself, and the question of what to do with it. Chapter 12. The Reckoning Surrender, Capture, and the Post-War Fate of the Japanese Submarine Fleet. The end of a war is not a single moment. It is a process sometimes slow, sometimes chaotic, always more complicated than the official narratives of surrender ceremonies and flag lowerings can fully capture. For the Japanese submarine fleet, the end of the Pacific War produced a series of situations and decisions that played out across weeks and months after the 15th of August, 1945, and whose consequences extended, in some cases, into decades of post-war history. The fate of the submarines, the machines, the technology they embodied, and the men who had built and operated them was determined by a convergence of military necessity, geopolitical calculation, and the practical demands of a post-war world that was already organizing itself around new anxieties. The immediate aftermath of the surrender order created operational complexity for Japanese submarine commanders at sea. Boats on patrol received the surrender instruction through coded radio transmissions, but the authentication of the message and the decision about how to respond were, in some cases, not straightforward. The culture of the Imperial Navy was not built around the processing of surrender orders. There was no doctrinal guidance for the situation, no established procedure for the transition from combat status to prisoner status while submerged in hostile waters. Individual commanders made individual decisions, some complying immediately, some waiting for confirmation from multiple sources before accepting that the message was genuine. There were no incidents of Japanese submarines refusing to surrender and continuing offensive operations after the formal capitulation, a significant fact that speaks to the discipline and ultimate institutional coherence of a permanent service that had been operating under extreme stress for nearly 4 years. The American reception of surrendered Japanese submarines was organized under the broader framework of Operation Paperclip and its naval equivalent, the systematic effort to capture, document, and exploit the technological knowledge embedded in German and Japanese military equipment before it could be destroyed or fall into Soviet hands. The I-400 class submarines were the highest priority targets of this effort. Their extraordinary size and unique aircraft carrying capability representing a category of naval technology that American engineers wanted to study in detail. American naval officers who inspected the Sentoku submarines described them in terms that conveyed genuine professional astonishment. The hangar construction, the aircraft launch catapult, the pressure hull integration of aircraft stowage, these were engineering solutions to problems that the American submarine program had not attempted, and the solutions were, in many cases, ingenious. The technical intelligence value of the I-400 class was recognized immediately by the American naval engineers who conducted the inspections. The question of what to do with the captured Japanese submarines, and specifically with the I-400 class, became entangled almost immediately with the geopolitical dynamics of the emerging post-war order. The Soviet Union, which had entered the Pacific War in its final days and was entitled under the Yalta Agreement to a share of the Japanese military equipment captured in the surrender, expressed interest in the Japanese submarine fleet and specifically in the most advanced vessels it contained. The American calculation about how much of Japan's submarine technology to share with the Soviets, or whether to share any of it at all, was not a comfortable one. The wartime alliance was already showing the stress fractures that would widen into the Cold War within a few years, and the prospect of Soviet naval engineers with access to the I-400 class technology, the aircraft-carrying submarine concept, the long-range hull design, the engineering integration of undersea and aviation capabilities was not one that American naval planners found appealing. The decision reached by American Naval Command regarding the captured I-400 submarines was direct and irreversible. The boats would be studied by American naval engineers, the technical documentation would be compiled and classified, and then the submarines themselves would be sunk deliberately in deep water in locations where they could not be recovered. In April of 1946, approximately 8 months after the surrender, the I-400 and I-401 were scuttled by American forces off the coast of Hawaii. The I-402 had already been lost to a collision with an American vessel during the transit to Hawaiian waters. The Seiran aircraft that had been recovered separately were transferred to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, where one survives to this day in the National Air and Space Museum, the only example of this aircraft type in existence anywhere in the world. The fate of the broader Japanese submarine fleet in the months after the surrender followed a pattern of survey, documentation, and disposal. A significant number of the surviving Japanese submarines were brought to the ports of Sasebo and Kure in Japan, where American and British naval teams conducted technical inspections before the vessels were scrapped or, in several cases, sunk as targets for weapons testing. The information gathered in these inspections was extensive and contributed to post-war submarine development programs in both the United States and, eventually, other Allied nations that received access to the technical reports. The knowledge embedded in the Japanese submarine program, the oxygen torpedo technology, the hull forms developed for the large fleet submarines, the aircraft hangar integration work of the Sentoku program fed, in various direct and indirect ways, into the post-war evolution of submarine design across the major naval powers. The American investigation into Japanese submarine operations conducted through the United States Strategic Bombing Survey's naval component and through the Naval Technical Mission to Japan produced a body of documentation that remains one of the most important primary sources for the history of Japanese submarine warfare. Japanese officers and engineers were interviewed extensively. Operational records that survived the end of the war were collected and translated. The systematic analysis of what the Japanese submarine fleet had done, how it had done it, and what its strategic impact had been produced. Assessments that shaped post-war naval thinking about submarine doctrine and deployment in ways that continue to influence naval planning to this day. The human dimension of the reckoning, the experience of the men who had served in the Japanese submarine fleet and survived to see the war's end was, predictably, not a simple or comfortable one. Japan's defeat was total, and the cultural and psychological implications of that defeat were severe for a military establishment that had organized itself around concepts of honor and sacrifice and ultimate triumph. Submarine veterans returned to a society that was simultaneously devastated by the war and occupied by the power that had defeated it, a society in which the markers of military identity that had structured these men's adult lives were now formally prohibited and socially suspect. The transition from naval officer to civilian in occupied Japan required a kind of personal renegotiation that many veterans found profoundly disorienting. The official post-war treatment of the Japanese submarine veterans by both the American occupation authorities and the subsequent Japanese government was shaped by the broader political and legal framework of the war crimes process and the occupation's denationalization program. Submarine officers who had been involved in specific incidents, the shelling of American coastal targets, operations in connection with special weapons, certain prisoner-of-war-related actions that had occurred in the context of submarine operations were subject to investigation and, in some cases, prosecution. The vast majority of submarine veterans were not involved in proceedings of any kind, and they returned to civilian life in the late 1940s to build careers in the commercial shipping industry, the nascent Japanese maritime self-defense force, or the expanding civilian economy of post-war Japan. The legacy that the Japanese submarine fleet left to posterity is one that history has taken many decades to fully assess. The technical achievements of the program, the oxygen-propelled long-lance torpedo, the Sentoku aircraft-carrying submarine design, the range and endurance of the I-class fleet submarines were genuine contributions to the engineering knowledge of undersea warfare, even if their strategic application was ultimately unsuccessful. The doctrinal failure that constrained the fleet's effectiveness, the insistence on fleet support and warship targeting at the expense of the commerce warfare that might have materially extended Japan's ability to fight, became one of the central case studies in post-war naval education about the relationship between doctrine and strategic outcome. The individual courage of the men who served in the fleet in conditions of extraordinary hardship, under increasing threat, for missions whose strategic value was declining even as the personal danger was rising, has never been seriously disputed by any serious student of the war, regardless of the national or political perspective from which the history is examined. The Pacific Ocean does not keep visible memorials to the submarines that sailed it in the years between 1941 and 1945. The pressures of the deep water that claimed so many Japanese submarines have long since compressed and scattered whatever physical remnants of those losses remain. The men who served in the boats that were lost are present in the ocean as an absence in the records that stop, in the patrol logs that end without a final entry, in the spaces their names occupy in the memorial registers at naval shrines that have stood through the post-war decades. The water keeps what it takes. The story, at least, can be told. And the telling is what this documentary has been attempting in the hours since we first went below the surface. We are still down here. There are more chapters to come. The Silent War has not finished revealing everything it holds. Chapters 13 through 18 continue with the Sentoku's final mission, what was planned and what was stopped, the Kaitan's last sorties and the men who did not return, the American submarine campaign's final accounting, technology recovered, what Japan's submarines taught the Cold War, the men left behind, veterans, memory, and the long silence, and the deep record, what the ocean still holds. Stay with us, we are going deeper. Chapter 13. The mission that never flew, the Sentoku's final orders, and the war that ended first. There is a particular kind of history that lives in the space between the order given and the order executed, in the gap between a weapon loaded and a weapon fired, between a mission planned and a mission flown. Most of history is made of actions, of things that happened and left marks in the world. But some of the most illuminating history lives in the things that were almost done, the decisions reached in full seriousness by men who believed the outcome mattered, who prepared with complete professional commitment, and who were stopped not by the enemy, but by the end of the war itself. The final mission of the Sentoku submarines belongs to that category. It was planned meticulously, prepared thoroughly, and cancelled at the last possible moment by a surrender that those who gave the orders had not, until the very last days, believed was coming. What was lost when that mission ended before it began is, depending on your perspective, either a relief or a tragedy, or in the strange moral arithmetic of war, something that resists being reduced to either. By the spring of 1945, the strategic situation facing Japan had moved well beyond the point where any realistic military planner could describe the war as winnable in conventional terms. The American bombing campaign against Japanese cities, conducted by B-29 superfortresses flying from the captured Marianas bases, had by March of that year begun the systematic destruction of Japan's industrial and urban centers. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of the 9th and 10th of March, 1945, was among the most destructive single raids in the history of aerial warfare, a fact that American commanders noted in their operational assessments, and that Japanese civilian survivors have described in testimonies spanning 8 decades. The oil supply situation had reached a point of genuine crisis. American submarine activity had so thoroughly disrupted Japanese tanker traffic that aviation fuel reserves were critically low and training programs for new pilots were being curtailed. The ground campaigns in Iwo Jima and Okinawa were extracting casualties at a rate that made the arithmetic of continued resistance increasingly difficult to sustain. And yet, within the machinery of the imperial military establishment, planning continued. Not because the outcome was thought to be reversible, not by the most clear-eyed analysts in the Navy's planning sections, but because the institutional and cultural logic of the Japanese military in the closing phase of the war demanded that resistance be maximized, that the cost of American victory be raised as high as possible, and that every weapon system available be committed to that purpose. The Sentoku submarines entered this final phase calculus in a specific and significant way. The I-400 and I-401, the two large aircraft-carrying submarines that had been completed and had achieved operational status, were the most capable long-range strike assets remaining. To the Imperial Navy in the summer of 1945, their ability to approach any point in the Pacific undetected, to surface briefly and launch aircraft, and then to disappear back beneath the surface, gave them a flexibility that no other remaining Japanese weapon system possessed. The question was not whether to use them, but where, and the target that eventually settled to the top of the planning discussions was not, as the original Yamamoto concept had envisioned, the Panama Canal. The target that was selected in the operational planning documents of the final months was the American fleet anchorage at Ulithi Atoll. This was the same anchorage that Kaitan-equipped submarines had struck in November of 1944, the enormous logistics base that was serving as the forward support point for American operations in the Western Pacific, and the staging area for the invasion forces that Japanese intelligence expected to be directed against the home islands. A successful strike against Ulithi, against the carriers and battleships and logistics vessels assembled there in enormous numbers, would not win the war. Nobody in the planning process believed it would. But it might kill enough ships and disrupt enough logistics to complicate and delay the invasion timetable. In a war where delay was the only strategy left, delay was worth any cost. The planning for what became known as the Hikari operation developed through the spring and early summer of 1945 with the serious, professional attention that the Japanese Navy's planning staff brought to any significant operational concept. The I-400 and I-401 were to approach Ulithi from the south, using the long-range capability that made them unique among available Japanese vessels, surfacing at a calculated distance from the atoll to launch their complement of Seiran aircraft in the early hours of a selected morning. The Seiran crews had trained for this mission, specifically rehearsing the rapid assembly sequence from folded storage configuration to launch-ready aircraft, the catapult procedure, the navigation approach to target, and the attack profile that gave the greatest probability of achieving hits on anchored vessels in the confined waters of the lagoon. The timeline from surfacing to first aircraft launch had been reduced by practice to a matter of minutes. The plan called for the aircraft to conduct their attacks, and then, in a detail that reflects how the war's final phase had reoriented the relationship between mission and survival, the pilots were given the option of attempting to ditch near the submarines for recovery, but the mission planning did not depend on that recovery being successful. The word option carried in the military culture of Japan in 1945 a weight that those who used it understood precisely. The Seiran aircraft that were assigned to the Ulithi mission were, in an operational decision that tells a significant story about the war's final phase, stripped of their floats. The floats, the pontoon assemblies that allowed the Seiran to land on water and be recovered alongside a surface submarine, were removed to reduce weight and increase the aircraft's speed and climb performance at the cost of any possibility of water landing and recovery. This decision was made deliberately, with full understanding of its implications. It was not presented in the planning documents as a sacrifice instruction, it was presented as an aerodynamic optimization. But the practical effect was the same. An aircraft that cannot land on water and cannot reach a land airfield is an aircraft that its pilot will fly until either the mission is complete or the fuel is gone. The removal of the floats from the Ulithi mission Seirans was a quiet acknowledgement, dressed in the language of engineering, of what the planners expected to happen to the aircraft and their crews. The I-400 and I-401 departed from Ominato Naval Base in northern Japan in late July of 1945, carrying their Seiran aircraft in the sealed hangars that had been designed specifically for this purpose. The submarines proceeded south on a course that would take them toward Ulithi, submerging during daylight hours and making cautious surface transits at night in waters that were increasingly patrolled by American aircraft and submarines. The crews aboard these boats were aware, with the particular clarity that comes from professional knowledge applied to a deteriorating situation, that the probability of completing the mission and returning was low. American anti-submarine coverage in the waters between Japan and the Central Pacific had reached a density that made any long-range transit hazardous, and the approach to Ulithi itself would require navigating through waters that American surface and air patrols actively covered. The submarines carried aboard them not just the Seiran aircraft and their pilots, but the last offensive ambition of a navy that had been reduced by 4 years of war to this final, extraordinary gamble. The mission was cancelled on the 15th of August, 1945, the day of the Emperor's broadcast. The submarines received the surrender order while at sea, still several days short of their launch position. The commanding officers of both vessels ordered the Seiran aircraft destroyed before surrendering. The aircraft were pushed over the side or disassembled and the components disposed of, a destruction that was partly a security measure and partly, in the understanding of those who ordered it, a form of respect for weapons that had been prepared for a purpose they would now never fulfill. The pilots who had trained for the Ulithi mission, who had practiced the approach and the attack sequence and the rapid assembly procedure until it was as familiar as breathing, stood on the decks of their submarines in the open Pacific and watched the aircraft they had trained in disappear into the ocean. Then they sailed to meet the Americans. The war was over. The mission that never flew joined the long list of things the Pacific War made possible but never delivered. The counterfactual dimensions of the cancelled Ulithi mission have been debated by naval historians ever since the details of the planning became available through post-war document declassification. Would the attack have succeeded? The American anti-submarine forces protecting the approaches to Ulithi were substantial by the summer of 1945, and the probability that both submarines would have reached their launch position undetected was not high. If they had reached the launch position, the Sea-Run aircraft fast, capable, and flown by pilots who had trained specifically for this mission, would have achieved some measure of surprise in the initial moments of an attack on an anchorage that was, by that point in the war, not expecting surface-launched aircraft from the south. Whether the surprise would have translated into significant damage against the warships and logistics vessels at Ulithi, and whether any damage achieved would have materially affected the invasion timetable, are questions without definitive answers. The honest answer is that the attack might have caused significant local destruction, but it would not have changed the outcome of the war, a war that by the summer of 1945 was being decided by forces that no submarine-launched aircraft strike, however skillfully executed, could have reversed. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki before the submarines reached their launch position. The world that the Ulithi mission had been planned for had ceased to exist while the submarines were still underwater. What the Sentoku's final mission reveals, in its incompleteness, is the character of the choices that the war had reduced Japan's military planners to in its closing months. The mission was real in its planning and preparation. The commitment of the men involved was genuine and complete. The engineering that made the mission possible, the submarines, the aircraft, the catapult systems, the specialized training, was extraordinary by any standard of the era. And all of it was aimed at a target that, even if hit, would not have changed the war's outcome. The resources, the skill, the courage, all directed toward an objective that was, in strategic terms, at best a delay, and at worst a gesture. This is not a criticism of the men who planned or would have executed the mission. It is an observation about the position that the war had placed them, in a position where the best available option was a gesture made with the most sophisticated weapon Japan had ever built. The Sentoku submarines represented the outer limit of Japanese naval imagination. Their final mission represented the outer limit of what that imagination could accomplish in a war that had already been decided. The physical remnants of the Sentoku program exist in 3 locations today. The I-400 and I-401 lie on the ocean floor off Hawaii, scuttled by the American Navy in 1946. The Sea-Run aircraft that was recovered and preserved is in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, where it hangs as a museum piece, an artifact of engineering, ambition, and strategic desperation in roughly equal measure. And the memory of the program lives in the accounts of the men who served in it, in the official records that were preserved from the post-war document collections, and in the historical literature that has, over the decades since the war, gradually assembled the full story of the submarines that were built to launch aircraft from beneath the ocean's surface and carry Japan's last offensive hope to a target they never reached. The ocean is the largest archive in the world. It keeps what it holds without comment. The I-400 class sleeps in it still. Chapter 14. The last sorties Khitan missions in the final year and the men who did not return. In the spring and summer of 1945, as the Pacific War compressed toward its conclusion and the geography of Japan's defensible perimeter contracted month by month, the Khitan program entered what would prove to be its final and most intensive operational phase. The logic that had driven the program's creation, the conviction that a human-guided weapon could achieve results against heavily defended targets that mechanical torpedoes could not, had not been validated by the creation. Results of the first operational deployments, but it had not been invalidated either, at least not in the institutional thinking of those who controlled the program's direction. The ambiguous results of earlier Khitan operations were interpreted, within the closed system of Imperial Navy command culture, not as evidence of fundamental strategic failure, but as proof that the weapon needed to be deployed in greater numbers and against better selected targets. More Khitan, more pilots, more mother submarines, more coordinated attacks. This was the direction in which the program moved as the war entered its final phase, even as the evidence accumulating from each deployment told a story that pointed in a different direction entirely. The expansion of Khitan training in late 1944 and early 1945 drew from a pool of volunteers that was both large and deeply motivated by the specific circumstances of Japan's deteriorating military situation. The young men who entered Khitan training in this period were different, in some measurable ways, from those who had formed the program's initial cohort. The first Khitan pilots had been submarine specialists with existing technical background in undersea operations, men whose professional training gave them a framework for understanding the weapon they were being asked to pilot. The expansion cohorts included a higher proportion of men drawn from surface fleet and aviation backgrounds, men whose transition to the Khitan required a more fundamental reorientation of their professional skills and instincts. Training programs were compressed to meet the demand for trained pilots. The time available between a pilot's entry into the program and his availability for operational deployment shortened as the war shortened. Men who, in another era of the conflict, might have spent a year or more in training, arrived at operational readiness in months. The implications of this compression for operational effectiveness were real, even if the program's commanders were not always willing to acknowledge them directly. The geography of Khitan operations in 1945 expanded as American forces moved closer to the Japanese home islands and the waters in which Khitan-equipped submarines could operate without transiting extremely long. Distances shifted accordingly. The approaches to Okinawa, contested through the spring and into the summer of that year, became a primary focus of Khitan deployment. The logistics shipping that sustained American operations at Okinawa, the tankers, ammunition ships, troop transports, and supply vessels that formed the enormous tail of the American amphibious operation, represented exactly the kind of dense, relatively slow-moving target array that the Khitan concept had been designed to exploit. Khitan-equipped submarines approached the Okinawa operational area in repeated sorties through the spring of 1945, attempting to penetrate the defensive screen that American anti-submarine forces had established around the invasion's logistics corridor. The results were consistent with the pattern established in earlier operations: individual contacts, claimed hits, confirmed losses of mother submarines, and an aggregate strategic impact that was negligible relative to the scale of the American effort being supported. The personal accounts of Khitan pilots who trained in the program and survived, because not all who entered Khitan training were deployed before the surrender, and not all who were deployed were actually launched, represent some of the most psychologically complex testimony to emerge from any branch of Japanese military service in the Pacific War. The preparation for a mission from which return was not expected created a particular relationship with time, with the days and hours before deployment, with the correspondence written to family members, with the small personal decisions about objects to keep and objects to give away that survivors have described in terms that resist easy categorization. This was not the resignation of despair. It was not, in most of the accounts, characterized by the theatrical emotionalism that post-war narratives about special attack units sometimes superimpose on the record. It was, more often, described as a kind of clarifying intensity, a state in which the noise of ordinary uncertainty was removed, and what remained was a very clear and very immediate sense of what mattered. Whether that state was an authentic psychological achievement or a product of the institutional pressures that shaped how Japanese military men were expected to feel and express themselves in extremity, is a question that no external observer can answer with confidence. The survivors themselves, in their later reflections, are not entirely certain. The operational mechanics of a Khitan sortie, as described in the training manuals and confirmed by survivor accounts, placed the pilot in a situation of profound sensory limitation from the moment of launch. Transferred into the weapon through the wet transfer tube of the mother submarine, while both vessels were still submerged, the pilot had access to a compass, a depth gauge, a limited periscope system, and the controls for speed and direction. Navigation to the target was accomplished by dead reckoning, calculating position from known starting point, elapsed time, speed, and heading a method that accumulated errors over distance and required constant mental correction. The periscope observations that were supposed to allow the pilot to locate and approach the target were constrained by the periscope's narrow field of view and the disorienting perspective of a low periscope height in a seaway. The acoustic environment inside the weapon, the noise of the propulsion system, the pressure changes associated with depth changes, the sounds of the ocean transmitted through the hull provided information about the surrounding environment, but not the kind of precise information that effective target acquisition required. Pilots were, in a meaningful sense, navigating by inference in conditions of near-total information scarcity. The losses among Khitan mother submarines during the operations of 1945 were substantial enough to constitute a serious drain on the conventional fleet submarine force at precisely the moment when every available boat was needed for the coastal defense preparations. Several large I-class submarines, vessels of genuine operational value that might have been employed in reconnaissance, supply, or conventional torpedo missions were sunk while carrying Khitan weapons on approach to or withdrawal from operational areas. The loss of these boats was compounded by the loss of the Khitan pilots. They were carrying weapons that never reached the water because the delivery vehicle was destroyed before it could complete its approach. The calculation of Khitan casualties therefore includes not only the pilots who were launched and did not return, but also the pilots who were lost with their mother submarines before launch, a category of loss that the program's official accounting sometimes treated separately, but that was, from the perspective of the men involved, indistinguishable in its outcome. The confirmed combat record of the Khitan program, as established by cross-referencing Japanese operational claims with American naval records in the post-war period, represents one of the Pacific War's more uncomfortable historical reckonings. The program consumed more than 100 pilots in combat operations and a significant number of additional lives in the loss of mother submarines and training accidents. The confirmed sinkings credited to Khitan attack after post-war verification removed the combat losses that American records attributed to other causes or that occurred within the range of Khitan operations but could not be definitively attributed to Khitan strikes were limited. The weapon achieved local successes, real hits, real ships damaged or sunk, but it did not achieve the strategic disruption of American logistics that had been the justification for its existence and its expansion. The ratio of cost to effect was, by any analytical standard, deeply unfavorable. The program produced more grief than result. This assessment, accurate as it is, and necessary as it is for any honest historical accounting, does not constitute the entirety of what needs to be said about the Khitan program and the men who served in it. History has a responsibility to the record, and the record says that the weapon was strategically ineffective. But history has a separate responsibility to the human beings whose lives the record documents, and those lives deserve more than reduction to a strategic outcome. The young men who entered Khitan training were not strategists. They were not responsible for the doctrine that had created the conditions in which the Khitan was conceived as a necessary weapon. They responded to their circumstances with the tools that their culture, their training, and their understanding of their duty provided them. That they did this in a cause whose strategic foundations were unsound, in service of a war that was already lost by the time most of them entered the program, does not diminish the seriousness of what they brought to it. It contextualizes it, places it in the larger machinery of a conflict that had moved beyond any single individual's power to influence. The Khitan pilots were caught in that machinery. They moved through it with as much dignity as the machinery allowed. The memorial at Otsujima, where Khitan pilots trained, has stood through the decades of post-war Japan as a place of quiet remembrance. The personal effects preserved there, letters, photographs, calligraphy, written in the days before departure, constitute a record of private human experience that no operational history can fully capture. Visitors who come to Otsujima stand in the spaces where young men prepared for something that has no civilian equivalent and no comfortable analogue in peacetime experience. The island is quiet now. The water that surrounds it is the same water that surrounds every other piece of land in the Japanese archipelago, the water that the Khitan pilots entered and did not return from, that the submarine crews navigated and, in many cases, did not surface from. The Pacific holds these men. It has held them for 8 decades. It will hold them for as long as memory and water both remain. Chapter 15. Technology recovered what Japan's submarines taught the Cold War. War's end. The knowledge accumulated in fighting them does not. When the Pacific War concluded in the late summer of 1945, the technology embedded in Japan's submarine fleet, the engineering solutions developed over 2 decades of design and construction, the operational knowledge generated by 4 years of combat, and the specific innovations of the Sentoku program entered a new context in which its military significance was immediately recognized by the powers that were already positioning themselves for the competition that would come to define the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War was not yet named, but its logic was already operational in the summer of 1945, and the race to capture and exploit the military technology of the defeated Axis powers was one of its earliest expressions. Japan's submarine technology was a significant prize in that race, and the efforts made to secure, study, and subsequently classify it by American naval intelligence shaped submarine development in ways that continued to be felt for decades. The United States Naval Technical Mission to Japan, established in the weeks following the surrender to conduct a systematic survey of Japanese naval technology, treated submarine-related subjects as among its highest priorities. Teams of American naval engineers and submarine specialists were dispatched to the shipyards at Kure and Sasebo, to the naval engineering establishments at Yokosuka, and to the surviving operational submarines at various anchorages around the Japanese coast. What they found represented a body of technical achievement that, in several specific areas, went beyond what American submarine engineering had accomplished by the same point in the war. The oxygen-propelled long-lance torpedo was studied with particular attention, a weapon that had been known, in general terms, to American naval intelligence before the war, but whose specific engineering details had not been fully available to American designers. The performance characteristics of the long lance, its range, speed, and traceless operation had made it the most capable ship-launched torpedo in the Pacific War, and the engineering principles behind its oxygen propulsion system were of immediate interest to American weapons developers. The Sentoku submarines attracted the most concentrated technical study of any single Japanese naval artifact. The hull design of the I-400 class, specifically the figure-8 cross-section that allowed the aircraft hangar to be integrated into the pressure hull structure without compromising the structural integrity, required for deep diving, was an engineering solution that American submarine designers had not developed independently. The hangar's watertight integrity systems, the catapult mechanism and its hydraulic power supply, the aircraft handling and assembly procedures developed for the confined space of the submarine deck. All of these were documented in technical reports that were classified and circulated within the American naval engineering establishment. The specific engineering solutions did not translate directly into American submarine designs. The Cold War submarine program took different directions, driven by different strategic priorities, but the knowledge that certain engineering combinations were possible, that problems which appeared insolvable had in fact been solved by Japanese engineers under wartime conditions, informed the boundaries within which American submarine designers understood themselves to be working. The German-Japanese technical exchange of the war years had given the American intelligence teams an additional dimension to investigate. The documentation captured at the end of the war included records of the materials and technical specifications that had been transported between Germany and Japan by submarine, and the American technical teams were able to piece together a picture of the specific technologies in which the two Axis powers had attempted to leverage each other's advances. The Walter turbine submarine propulsion system, a closed-cycle propulsion technology that German engineers had been developing and that Japan had received documentation and components for through the exchange program, was of considerable American interest because it pointed toward a class of submarine propulsion that could, in theory, reduce or eliminate the need for battery recharging at the surface. The development of submarine propulsion systems that could sustain underwater operation for extended periods without surfacing was one of the central engineering challenges of post-war submarine development, and the wartime German and Japanese work in this area contributed to the thinking that eventually led to nuclear submarine propulsion. The Soviet Union's access to Japanese submarine technology was a subject of significant American concern in the months following the surrender. The Yalta Agreement's provisions entitled the Soviets to a portion of the captured Japanese military equipment, and Soviet naval teams were present in Japan during the post-war period, conducting their own surveys of available technology. The extent to which Soviet engineers obtained access to the most sensitive Japanese submarine technical information, particularly the Sentoku's aircraft hangar engineering and the Long Lance torpedo specifications, is a subject on which the historical record remains incomplete, partly because Soviet archival access remains restricted in many relevant areas. What the historical record does show is that American decisions about which Japanese submarines to scuttle and which technical documents to classify and restrict were made with explicit reference to the Soviet intelligence gathering. The scuttling of the Sentoku submarines in 1946 was, in the internal American naval planning documents that addressed it, specifically framed as a denial operation aimed at preventing Soviet access to the engineering of the aircraft-carrying submarine concept. The Cold War was being fought, in this respect, in the waters off Hawaii in the spring of 1946. The influence of Japanese submarine technology on American post-war submarine development operated through several channels simultaneously. The direct technical study of captured equipment provided information about specific engineering solutions. The operational analysis of Japanese submarine campaign conducted through the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and through direct interviews with Japanese submarine officers and engineers provided strategic doctrinal lessons that shaped American thinking about how submarines should be used and what they should be designed to do, and the broader recognition that the Pacific War had demonstrated the decisive potential of submarine warfare against commerce. American submarines against Japan reinforced the priority that the post-war American Navy placed on anti-submarine warfare capabilities, on the grounds that any future adversary with access to a large submarine fleet would pose the same kind of threat to American ocean commerce and military logistics that American submarines had posed to Japan. The lessons of the Pacific Submarine War, from both sides of it, were incorporated into the doctrinal and engineering frameworks that guided American naval planning through the first decades of the Cold War. The Japanese maritime defense establishment that gradually rebuilt in the 1950s and 1960s under the provisions of the peace treaty that permitted Japan to maintain defensive military forces drew on the knowledge and experience of the wartime submarine service in ways that were carefully managed by both Japanese and American authorities during the occupation period. Former submarine officers who had served in the Imperial Navy's undersea fleet occupied significant roles in the development of the post-war Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces submarine arm. The specific technical knowledge they brought, the practical understanding of submarine operations in the Pacific's specific oceanographic conditions, the hard-won tactical knowledge of how submarines behaved in the thermal gradients and current patterns of Western Pacific waters was genuinely valuable and not easily replaceable by classroom instruction or American advisors, who lacked the same geographical familiarity. The rebuilding of Japan's submarine capability after the war was, in important respects, a transmission of knowledge from the men who had operated in the Pacific War to a new generation of officers serving a dramatically different national purpose. The Cold War submarine technology competition, the development of nuclear-powered submarines by the United States beginning in the mid-1950s, the subsequent Soviet nuclear submarine program, the expansion of Western submarine capabilities through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s was not a direct continuation of the Second World War submarine programs in any simple sense. The technologies were different, the strategic context was different, the doctrine was different. But the foundations of Cold War submarine thinking were built on the lessons positive and negative of the Pacific War's submarine campaigns. The understanding that submarine warfare could be strategically decisive when aimed at commerce and supply lines, the understanding that anti-submarine warfare required a layered, multi-platform approach combining surface, air, and subsurface assets. The understanding that submarine technology developed in secrecy could spring operational surprises on unprepared adversaries. All of these were conclusions the Pacific War had made inescapable, and all of them shaped the strategic thinking of the Cold War's naval competition. Japan's submarine fleet, defeated and scuttled and studied in the years after 1945, left a fingerprint on the naval world that outlasted both the fleet and the war that built it. The I-400's engineering legacy is perhaps best measured not in any specific system that copied its solutions, but in the expansion of the conceptual boundary that it demonstrated. Before the Sentoku class, the aircraft-carrying submarine was a theoretical possibility discussed in naval architecture circles, but never reduced to engineering practice at scale. After the Sentoku class, it was a demonstrated achievement, something that had been built, that worked, that had been seen and studied by the engineers of every major naval power. The idea that a submarine could carry and launch aircraft was no longer speculative after 1945. It was a fact, established by engineering. What the post-war decades did with that fact, the concept of the submarine as a covert launcher of strategic weapons, the development of the submarine-launched ballistic missile as the most survivable element of nuclear deterrence, followed a different path than the manned aircraft model that the Sentoku had embodied. But the conceptual leap, the understanding that a submarine could be a platform for projecting force at great distance in forms other than the torpedo connects, in the history of naval ideas, to the moment when Japanese engineers solved the problem of hanging an aircraft hangar on a pressure hull and sent it to sea. Chapter 16. The men left behind: veterans, memory, and the long silence after the war. History tends to move forward. It follows the logic of subsequent events, traces the lines of cause and effect, and organizes the past around the outcomes that the present treats as significant. But the men who lived through the Japanese submarine war did not move forward in the same way that history did. They moved forward in the particular way that human beings move forward after catastrophic experiences, unevenly, incompletely, carrying the weight of what they had lived through in ways that changed shape over the years, but never fully resolved into something light enough to put down. The veterans of the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine service returned, those who survived, to a Japan that was physically devastated, culturally disrupted, and under foreign occupation for the first time in its history. What they brought back from the submarine war, the knowledge, the memories, the relationships between men who had lived in sealed metal tubes in the deep ocean together, had no obvious place in the world that was being built around them. The silence that many of them maintained about their wartime experience for years and sometimes decades was not simply a product of political pressure or social stigma. It was the silence of men who understood that what they had experienced could not be easily translated into words that the post-war world was prepared to hear. The occupation period imposed specific constraints on the public expression of Japanese military experience. The Allied occupation authorities' policies regarding education, media, and public discourse were designed to prevent the rehabilitation of the military nationalism that had driven Japan's war, and the practical effect of these policies was to create a cultural environment in which open, positive discussion of military service was socially and legally uncomfortable. Former military officers who attempted to publish memoirs, conduct public lectures, or otherwise communicate their wartime experience in terms that acknowledged military values, honor, courage, professional skill, duty found themselves navigating a landscape in which such communication was treated with suspicion by both the occupation authorities and by a Japanese public that was exhausted by war and in many cases deeply ambivalent about the institutions that had led the nation into it. The submarine veterans, like veterans of every other branch of Japanese military service, adjusted their public presentation of their wartime experience to the requirements of the environment in which they were living. Many simply did not discuss it at all. The transition from professional naval officer to civilian life in occupied Japan was, for many submarine veterans, a transformation that required not merely a change of employment, but a fundamental reorientation of identity. These were men who had spent their adult professional lives in a highly structured, purpose-defined institutional environment, one in which rank, Role, expertise, and mission provided a framework of meaning that civilian life in post-war Japan did not automatically replace. The commercial shipping industry absorbed a significant number of former naval officers, including submarine veterans whose understanding of the sea and of seamanship translated reasonably well to peacetime merchant service. Others entered engineering, manufacturing, education, and the various sectors of the rebuilding Japanese economy. The professional skills that submarine service had developed, the technical knowledge, the capacity for sustained attention under pressure, the habit of systematic thinking about complex problems in confined time were genuinely transferable to civilian contexts. But the particular professional identity of the submarine officer, the sense of belonging to a small, highly trained, operationally elite community within an institution that had defined national purpose, was not something that peacetime employment could replicate. The social relationships formed within the submarine service proved, for many veterans, to be among the most enduring human connections of their lives. Men who had shared the compressed, intense, and mutually dependent experience of submarine patrol, who had eaten together, slept in adjacent bunks, watched each other manage fear and fatigue and the accumulated stress of weeks below the surface, maintained those connections across the post-war decades with a consistency that reflected the depth of the bond that shared extreme experience creates. Veterans associations formed in the years after the occupation ended, providing frameworks within which former submarine crew members could maintain contact, commemorate lost shipmates, and share the specific memories that outsiders, even sympathetic outsiders, could not fully access. These associations became, for many of their members, the primary institutional context in which their submarine service was openly acknowledged and remembered. Outside the association meetings, many veterans continued to maintain the silence that post-war circumstances had initially imposed. The gradual shift in Japan's post-war engagement with its military history, a complex, contested, and still ongoing process that has moved through multiple phases across 8 decades, created, by the 1970s and 80s, some space for submarine veterans to speak more openly about their wartime experience. The publication of memoirs and oral history collections, some conducted by academic historians, others by journalists, others by the veterans themselves or their families, began to accumulate a body of first-person testimony about the submarine war that complemented, and in many cases, challenged the official operational histories that had been compiled from documentary sources. The personal testimonies revealed dimensions of the submarine experience that the operational records necessarily omitted: the texture of daily life aboard the boats, the relationships between officers and enlisted men, the management of fear in a context where fear was a constant and reasonable response to the actual conditions, and the moral and psychological dimensions of conducting a war in a medium as absolute and unforgiving as the deep ocean. The families of men lost in the submarine war occupied a different, and in some respects more difficult position than the veterans themselves. The nature of submarine loss, sudden, total, typically in waters far from Japan, without remains or visible grave, created a particular form of grief that was both profound and structurally unresolved. There was no body to bury, no grave to visit, no physical location where the loss had occurred that could be incorporated into the geography of memory. The ocean is not a cemetery in any form that human bereavement rituals are designed to engage with. The families of lost submariners had official notifications, photographs, personal effects that had been left behind before the final deployment, and the testimony of surviving crew members who had known their husband or son or father as a living professional. They did not have a place in the world where they could go to be near what remained of him, because what remained of him was at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean at a depth that put it beyond any form of human access. This kind of loss, absolute, locationless, unverifiable, sits differently in the body of grief than loss that leaves a physical trace. The commemorative culture that developed around the Japanese submarine service in the post-war decades reflected the broader tensions and evolution of Japan's engagement with its wartime past. Official commemoration, the acknowledgement of submarine service through government channels, the inclusion of submarine veterans in national memorial observances developed slowly and unevenly, shaped by the political sensitivities that surrounded any formal recognition of the imperial military's legacy in post-war Japan. The private commemorative practices of veterans associations, the memorial services conducted at Yasukuni Shrine, the gatherings at the naval memorial sites at Kure and elsewhere, the internal publications that preserved unit histories and individual testimony, maintained the memory of the submarine service within the community of those who had direct connection to it, long before that memory found any broader public acknowledgement. The submarine story was kept alive in the decades of silence by the men who had lived it and by the families of the men who had not come back from it. The submarine memorial structures that exist in Japan today, the preserved vessels, the museum collections, the memorial sites at locations associated with submarine training and operations, represent a partial and imperfect physical expression of a memory that is carried primarily in human beings and in documents, rather than in objects. The I-61 at the Kure Maritime Museum, one of the few surviving Japanese submarines from the wartime period, gives visitors a physical sense of the scale and interior conditions of the boats in which the submarine war was fought, the narrowness of the passages, the density of equipment in every available space, the particular quality of light and air inside a sealed metal hull. Standing inside a preserved submarine is not the same as understanding what it meant to be inside one when the sea was full of enemies, but it is closer than standing outside and imagining. It is a reminder that history is not only events and decisions and outcomes, it is also spaces, particular, physical, dimensional spaces in which human beings lived and worked and sometimes died. The spaces are still here. The men who inhabited them are mostly gone. The story that connects the two is what this documentary has been attempting to tell. Chapter 17: The Deep Record Wrecks, Research, and What the Ocean Still Holds. The Pacific Ocean is the largest archive in the world. It holds, in its depths, the physical remains of a war that ranged across more than 64 million square miles of water, the wreckage of warships and aircraft and submarines sunk across 4 years of industrialized conflict, in a theater whose scale dwarfed any previous naval war in human history. The submarines that were lost in the Pacific War, Japanese, American, British, Dutch, and Australian, lie at various depths across an enormous area, from the shallow coastal waters of the Japanese home islands to the abyssal plains of the Central Pacific, where the ocean floor lies more than 6,000 meters below the surface. They are the war's deepest archive. They are also, in most cases, the deepest graves that human beings have ever been buried in. The relationship between these two facts, that the wrecks are both historical archives and human graves, shapes the ethics and practice of the underwater exploration that has gradually, across the decades since the war, extended human access to the deep record of the Pacific submarine campaign. The technology that makes deep ocean wreck exploration possible developed through the second half of the 20th century in parallel with, and in many cases driven by, the same Cold War naval competition whose intellectual foundations were laid by the Pacific War's technological lessons. The deep submergence vehicles developed for Cold War military purposes for the location and recovery of lost nuclear weapons and the monitoring of adversary submarine activity were adapted over time for scientific and historical research applications that took them to wrecks far beyond the reach of conventional diving. The location of the I-400 in the waters off Hawaii, the scuttled Sentoku submarine, lying in the deep water where the American Navy sent it in 1946, was achieved by the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory using precisely this kind of deep submergence technology. The wreck, when found, was in remarkably coherent condition, the same robust construction that had made the I-400 class extraordinary vessels in their operational life had preserved the hull against the decades of deep ocean pressure in a way that gave the researchers who found it a recognizable relationship with the engineering drawings that had been created 60 years earlier at the Yokosuka Naval Construction Bureau. The Ward sunk in the opening minutes of the Pacific War, the midget submarine that the USS Ward attacked and sank at 21 minutes before 4 on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, was located by the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory in the deep water off the entrance to Pearl Harbor in the late summer of 2002. The wreck lies at a depth that places it well below the range of conventional diving, in water so deep that the only access is by remotely operated vehicle. The identification of the wreck as the ward's target, establishing it as the first vessel engaged in combat by the United States Navy in the Second World War, was achieved through the correlation of the wreck's physical characteristics with the ward's after-action report describing the target's appearance, the angle of the attack, and the estimated position of the sinking. The wreck was designated a formal element of the Pearl Harbor National Historic Landmark, a status that carries legal protection against disturbance and establishes the American government's recognition that the site is both historically significant and a place of human remains. It has not been disturbed. It rests where it sank, in the dark, at a depth where the light from the surface does not reach, and the world of 1941 and the world of the present are connected only by the cold column of water above it. The broader project of locating and documenting Japanese submarine wrecks across the Pacific has advanced substantially in the decades since the ward's target was found, driven by the combination of improved deep ocean survey technology, increased availability of declassified operational records from both American and Japanese archives, and a growing recognition within the maritime archaeology community that the submarine wrecks of the Second World War are sites of significant historical and human importance that deserve systematic documentation before whatever natural deterioration process the deep ocean imposes on steel structures progresses beyond the point where meaningful information can be recovered. The deep Pacific is not a uniform environment. The chemistry of the water, the temperature, the depth of the site, the nature of the sediment in which a wreck may be partially buried, and the current patterns that govern the distribution of marine life and chemical processes all vary significantly across the theatre, and the condition of individual wrecks reflects this variability. Some wrecks are remarkably preserved. Others have deteriorated to the point where identification requires the correlation of multiple lines of evidence from sonar imaging, remotely operated vehicle visual inspection, and archival research. The ethical framework within which deep ocean wreck exploration operates has evolved considerably since the early post-war decades, when some wreck sites were disturbed without meaningful oversight or protection. International maritime law, national heritage protection frameworks, and the evolving professional ethics of the maritime archaeology community have together established a set of principles that treat wartime wrecks containing human remains as protected war graves, sites where physical disturbance is restricted or prohibited, and where the primary mode of engagement is documentation and non-invasive survey rather than recovery. These principles are not uniformly applied across all maritime jurisdictions, and not all actors who access wreck sites operate within the professional ethics of the archaeological community. The illegal recovery of artifacts from wartime wrecks for commercial sale remains an ongoing problem in some areas of the Pacific. But the framework exists. It has legal and moral force in the contexts where it is applied, and it represents a meaningful advance over the absence of any ethical framework that characterized the early post-war decades of undersea exploration. The Japanese government's engagement with the question of its wartime underwater heritage has been careful and deliberate. The formal recognition that wartime submarine wrecks are war graves, that the physical remains of lost submarines are, simultaneously, archaeological sites and the resting places of the crews who were aboard when those submarines were lost, has been expressed through the development of memorial diving programs at some accessible wreck sites and through diplomatic discussions about the status of Japanese wrecks located in the territorial waters of other nations. The depth of most Pacific War submarine wrecks makes conventional diving access impossible, but the accessible sites, shallow water wrecks in coastal waters and harbour approaches have in some cases become subjects of memorial observance, in which descendants of lost crew members and official representatives, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, participate. These observances are not archaeologically significant in the technical sense, but they are humanly significant in a way that the technical aspects of wreck documentation do not capture. They are the living reaching toward the dead across a barrier of time and water that only the imagination can fully cross. The question of what the deep record still holds, what wrecks remain unlocated, what physical evidence of the submarine war has not yet been found or documented, is one that the improving capabilities of deep ocean survey technology keep revising in the direction of greater completeness. Wrecks that were considered effectively inaccessible a generation ago are now accessible to survey by autonomous underwater vehicles that can map the ocean floor at resolutions that make individual hull features identifiable. The databases that archive the locations of known wrecks, the parameters of known losses, and the results of completed surveys are growing. The gaps in the record are narrowing. Some Japanese submarines known to have been lost in specific operational areas have not yet been found. Their wrecks lie somewhere in the vast spaces of the Pacific floor, in water too deep or too remote or too poorly charted for current survey capabilities to have located them. Future surveys will narrow the gap. The ocean is large. The search is patient. The record will eventually be more complete than it is now, though whether it will ever be complete is a question that the scale of the Pacific makes prudent caution appropriate about answering. What the deep record represents, in the final analysis, is not only information about a war that ended 8 decades ago, it represents the material trace of choices made by human beings under extraordinary circumstances. The choices of engineers who designed these vessels, commanders who deployed them, crews who sailed in them, and the forces on the other side that detected and engaged and sometimes destroyed them. Every wreck on the ocean floor is a node in a network of decisions, a point at which the chain of cause and effect that ran from a pre-war political calculation through a tactical engagement to a final plunge into the deep became fixed and permanent. The deep record does not judge these decisions, it simply holds their physical consequences, in water that has no opinion about what it contains. The judgment, the effort to understand what the decisions meant, what they produced, what they might have produced differently, belongs to history. And history belongs to the living, who are the only ones left to conduct it. Chapter 18. The Silent Lesson. What the Japanese submarine war means now. Every significant episode in military history carries within it a set of lessons that do not expire with the conflict that generated them. Some of those lessons are technical, about the performance characteristics of specific weapon systems, about the effectiveness of particular tactical approaches in defined environmental conditions, about the engineering solutions to specific operational problems. These technical lessons have a half-life. They become obsolete as technology changes, as new weapons replace old ones and new operational environments replace old ones. But other lessons are structural about the relationship between doctrine and outcome, between institutional culture and strategic effectiveness, between the willingness to adapt and the cost of rigidity. These structural lessons do not expire. They change their clothing with each new era, but they remain recognizable to anyone looking for them, because they are lessons about how human organizations behave under pressure and how the decisions made in peacetime shape the capabilities available in war. The Japanese submarine campaign of the Second World War is rich in both categories of lesson, but it is the structural lessons that deserve the most sustained attention from anyone interested in understanding not just this particular war, but the permanent patterns of military organization and strategic decision-making that wars illuminate. The central structural lesson of the Japanese submarine campaign is, at its core, a lesson about the relationship between doctrine and reality, about what happens when the framework used to plan and direct a military capability is not adequately revised in response to the evidence that the operational environment is generating about the framework's inadequacy. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the Second World War with a submarine doctrine that had been developed during the 1920s and 30s, refined through a series of fleet exercises and embedded in formal operational instructions that governed how submarine commanders were expected to employ their boats and what priorities they were expected to assign to competing mission demands. That doctrine centered on fleet support, warship attack, and the preparation for a decisive surface battle was not irrational in the context in which it was developed. It reflected a coherent theory of how a naval war between Japan and the United States would unfold, and it assigned the submarine a role within that theory that made institutional sense given the Navy's broader strategic vision. The problem was that the war did not unfold the way the theory predicted. The decisive battle came at Midway, and Japan lost it. The strategic logic that had given the submarine doctrine its coherence evaporated, and the doctrine was not fundamentally revised to account for the new reality. The contrast with American submarine doctrine, which was deliberately and systematically revised in the first year of the war to align with the commerce warfare mission that the operational evidence was demonstrating to be the most strategically productive application of submarine capability, is illuminating precisely because the two navies began from roughly comparable positions. Both entered the war with doctrines that were imperfectly aligned with the most effective use of their submarine fleets. Both discovered this misalignment through operational experience in the first year of the conflict. One revised its doctrine, the other maintained it with modifications insufficient to change the fundamental orientation. The difference in strategic outcome, a decisive American submarine campaign versus a Japanese submarine campaign that produced results well below its potential, followed from this doctrinal divergence in ways that become clearer the more closely the campaigns are compared. The lesson is not that the Americans were smarter or braver or more committed than the Japanese. The lesson is that organizational willingness to revise doctrine in response to operational evidence is a military capability as important as any weapon system, and that cultures which make such revision difficult for reasons of hierarchy, tradition, institutional identity, or political pressure pay a strategic price for that difficulty. The Kaiten program and the broader special attack strategy of the war's final phase represent a separate but related structural lesson about the relationship between individual sacrifice and strategic effectiveness. The willingness of Japanese military culture to accept and institutionalize individual sacrifice as a weapons technology, to construct programs whose operation required the deaths of their operators as a design feature rather than a risk, was an expression of values that the institutional culture of the imperial military had cultivated and that found its fullest expression in the circumstances of defeat. The individual courage involved in these programs was genuine. The institutional use to which that courage was put was, by any strategic analytical standard, inefficient because the programs consumed resources, training, investment, and irreplaceable human talent in ways that produced strategic returns far below what the same resources and talent, applied differently, might have achieved. The lesson here is not a simple or comfortable one. It is not a lesson that lends itself to easy moral conclusions, because the moral dimensions of special attack programs are genuinely complex. But the strategic lesson is available to anyone willing to look at the outcome data. Individual sacrifice, however sincere and however costly, does not substitute for strategic clarity. A weapon program that requires its operators to die with it has already accepted a fundamental inefficiency into its design, an inefficiency that limits how much of the program's results can be applied to future operations because the operators are not available to communicate what they learned. The technological legacy of the Japanese submarine program, the engineering achievements that survived the war's end and fed into the Cold War naval competition, carries its own lesson about the relationship between innovation and application. Japan produced, in the Sentoku class and the Long Lance torpedo and the Kaiten program, weapons of genuine originality that demonstrated solutions to engineering problems that other navies had not solved. The intellectual and material investment that produced these innovations was real and substantial. But the strategic application of those innovations was constrained by doctrinal frameworks and institutional priorities that prevented them from being used in ways that might have maximized their military value. The Sentoku submarines were ready to conduct operations that might have achieved significant local effects if deployed earlier and in different strategic circumstances. The Long Lance torpedo was a weapon that, had it been made the centerpiece of a sustained commerce warfare campaign, might have produced results comparable in kind, if not in scale, to those achieved by the American Mark 14 once its technical problems were resolved. Innovation that cannot be translated into effective strategic application through appropriate doctrine and institutional support does not realize its potential a lesson as relevant to 21st century military competition as it was to the Second World War. The human dimension of the Japanese submarine campaign carries a final lesson that is perhaps the most difficult to articulate in analytical terms, but the most important to acknowledge in any account that aspires to treat its subject. Honestly, the men who served in Japan's submarines, who built the fleet, who trained for the war, who conducted the patrols, who endured the supply runs, who piloted the kaiten, who waited in the Sentoku hangars for orders that came too late, were not abstractions. They were specific human beings with specific skills and specific commitments who found themselves inside a set of circumstances that the decisions of others had created and that they individually lacked the power to change. The institutional failures that constrained the strategic effectiveness of their service, the doctrinal rigidity, the command culture that discouraged upward critique, the misalignment of mission and capability were not their failures. They were the failures of the organizations above them, shaped by the political and strategic decisions that had placed Japan in a war it could not win. The men in the boats did what the men in the boats could do. They sailed where they were told. They fought as effectively as their training and equipment and the doctrine governing their use allowed. They died in proportions that no military service should be asked to sustain. The Pacific War ended in August of 1945 with the surrender of Imperial Japan, a surrender that was itself shaped in ways that continue to be analysed and debated by the full weight of the combined Allied campaign of which the submarine commerce war was a central element. The oil that had stopped flowing to Japan's refineries, the steel that had stopped arriving at Japan's shipyards, the food that had stopped reaching Japan's cities, all of it stopped moving because the ships that carried it were being sent to the ocean floor by submarines, operating under a doctrine that had correctly identified Japan's supply chain as its most vulnerable strategic target. The submarines did not end the war alone, but they cut the arteries that fed every other element of Japan's ability to continue it. The final surrender was, in part, a submarine victory achieved not in a single dramatic engagement, but in thousands of individual attacks, on thousands of individual ships, across millions of square miles of ocean, over nearly 4 years of sustained, systematic, largely invisible effort. The contrast between the two submarine campaigns, the American campaign that helped win the war and the Japanese campaign that failed to alter its outcome, should not produce the comfortable conclusion that one navy was simply better than the other. It should produce a more uncomfortable and more useful conclusion that the decisions made before wars begin about doctrine and culture and institutional priorities and the willingness to revise those things in the face of evidence matter as much as the weapons themselves. Japan built extraordinary submarines. It built them with genuine engineering brilliance, with institutional seriousness, and with the investment of enormous national resources. It crewed them with brave and skilled men. And then it aimed them at the wrong targets, constrained them with inflexible doctrine, consumed them in missions that did not serve the strategy that could have made them decisive, and failed to revise its approach in time to change the outcome. The ocean took the submarines and the men in them. History took the lesson. Whether the lesson has been learned, whether the structural patterns that constrained Japanese submarine effectiveness in the Second World War have been recognized and addressed in the military institutions of the nations that followed, is a question that each generation of military planners has to answer for itself, with whatever honestly they can bring to the task. There is one final thing to say about the Japanese submarine war, and it is perhaps the most important thing. The silence of submarines, the quality that gives this documentary its title, that defined the operational character of the weapon and the experience of the men who sailed in them, was not merely a tactical feature. It was a statement about how the war was fought in the depths. The great surface battles of the Pacific War, Coral Sea, Midway, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf were visible events. They produced photographs and after-action reports and immediately legible outcomes. The submarine war produced none of these things in the same way. It happened in the dark, below the threshold of public visibility, in a medium that resisted the kind of direct observation that produces the images and the narratives that history conventionally runs on. The men who fought it on both sides did so in a silence that the world above the surface rarely penetrated. That silence protected them operationally and obscured them historically. This documentary has been an attempt, sustained across these 18 chapters, to penetrate that silence, to bring the submarine war up from the depths where it happened, and hold it in the light long enough for its full shape to become visible. The Pacific is still out there. The depth is unchanged. The wrecks are still down in the dark where they have been since the moments they were lost. The ocean does not narrate. It does not explain. It simply holds what it holds, in the silence that is the permanent condition of its deepest places. The story of the men who went into that silence, who sealed themselves inside metal tubes and sank below the surface of the largest ocean in the world and conducted a war that most people above the surface never fully understood, is the story that this documentary has been telling. It is a story that deserves to be heard, not because it changes anything, not because it produces comfortable conclusions or clean moral categories or the satisfying resolution that narrative drama promises, but because it happened, because the men were real, because the machines were extraordinary, because the choices that shaped the campaign were made by human beings who believed they were serving something worth serving, in circumstances that no amount of peacetime imagination fully prepares a person for. They went down into the dark. They did what they could. The ocean kept the rest. We are surfacing now. After 18 chapters and the full arc of the silent war in the Pacific, from the first Holland-type submarines assembled at Yokosuka in 1904 to the scuttled Sentoku giants on the floor of the Pacific off Hawaii in 1946, we have followed the story as far as it goes in the public record. The silent war is over. The history of it is still being written, one recovered document and one located wreck at a time, in the slow and patient work of historians and archaeologists and the families of the men who did not come home. If you have stayed with us through all 18 chapters, through the long watch, through the dark water, through the full history of Japanese submarine warfare in the Second World War, then you know now what the silent war was. You know what it cost. You know what it produced and what it failed to produce and why. That knowledge is the only thing the men in the submarines can still give to the world above the surface. It is worth having. Thank you for watching. Sleep well.